Tyranny of Steel. Author Zentmeister. Chapters 1 to 15. Chapter 1. Transmigrating to Another World. Lieutenant Julian Weber gazed across the construction project his unit was responsible for. As the U.S. involvement in the war in Afghanistan came to a close, he was stuck building a bridge in the middle of nowhere for some god-forsaken country. If there was one thing he had learned during his 4 years as an officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it was unwise to criticize the High Command's stupidity openly. Thus he kept his mouth shut as he and the other officers mapped out the construction project while the enlisted personnel was hard at work building the massive bridge that served virtually no purpose whatsoever to U.S. forces who were already fleeing the country in large numbers. That's right, fleeing. Julian may not care for a hellhole like Afghanistan. Still, he considered it a monumental loss to pull out of the country when the Afghan National Army was clearly incapable of contending with the Taliban without U.S. support. In his mind, the U.S. had invested over $2.2 trillion in the war and thousands of lives, yet before their mission was complete, they were pulling out. Leaving a fledgling democratic country like Afghanistan, which the U.S. had installed as a puppet state to fend for themselves. This was Iraq and Vietnam all over again, and we all know how that turned out. Despite his internal protests over the geopolitical situation, he was glad to be out of the region on a personal level. He was much more comfortable sitting in the barracks of some base in the homeland playing strategy games, city builders, and agricultural simulators. When he wasn't working, he played such games or educated himself on history, philosophy, politics, economics, and old technology. After all, he was a fairly educated individual, having graduated at the top of his class in civil engineering from Westpoint. During his youth, he always had a fascination with engineering. If you gave him a toy, he was more interested in taking it apart and putting it back together than he was playing with it. As he grew into adolescence, he had spent most of his time on the web or in a library researching history and how the industrial and agricultural revolutions came to be, the significant improvements in technology, and how to replicate them. With a photographic memory and an above-average IQ, he could commit these things to his permanent memory. During his college years, he once more focused on his studies, taking many unnecessary electives. By the time he graduated and entered the armed forces, he was practically a walking textbook of knowledge ranging from liberal arts to technical knowledge. Obviously, this did not do him any favors in the dating scene. Largely because this is how he chose to spend his free time, he was quite obviously perpetually single and had no dependents to rely upon him. Not even a house pet, as he considered pawning them off to a relative while he was deployed a hassle for not only himself but his relatives as well. Yet here he was, stuck in the Middle East, engaging in a construction project in a country the U.S. military had already declared its full withdrawal date, which was only a month away. He didn't understand the brass thinking, but it was just another enormous waste of the taxpayers' money at the end of the day. I mean, sure, the Afghan National Army could use the bridge for tactical purposes, but could they seriously not build it themselves? That was obviously a rhetorical question he was asking himself, as he was well aware of the degree of competency he could expect from the ANA and was not impressed. While he was thinking of such trivial things, he could hear the voices of a few non-commissioned officers joking around in the background, discussing how they intended to celebrate the end of the war. These older men had been in the war far too long and did have a shred of nationalism left in their bodies. As such, they did not care about the loss the country faced in this land, they only cared about going home. Not that he could blame them. Just as one of the NCOs was about to mention their plans, a large explosion went off in the distance, and the whistling sound of a shell in the air could be heard as it headed in Julian's direction. Only a single thought crossed Julian's mind as he gazed at the shell coming down upon him. Fuck my life. And with that final thought, his consciousness was engulfed in the blast of the explosive shell, as well as the lives of the other officers in the area. He was truly and utterly dead. Berengar awoke with a shout as his hoarse voice echoed throughout the large stone room. His eyes darting frantically across the area. After careful examination, he realized he was not blown up by an artillery shell but instead lying on a massive bed with a canopy above. Near his bedside was a young girl at the early stage of adolescence gazing at him with fearful eyes. Henrietta was his younger sister. Despite her youth, she was already quite pretty, with long blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes the color of the sky. As he gazed upon the frightened girl, he quickly thought to himself something of significant importance. Henrietta, sister? Since when did I have a sister? What is going on? And why was that my first thought upon observing this stranger? Berengar furrowed his brows as he searched his memories. It would appear that in his mind were two sets of memories. One was of the body in which he currently resided, in whose identity was Berengar von Kufstein, son of Sieghard von Kufstein and heir to the Barony of Kufstein. He was 20 years old this year. The other set of memories belonged to Julian Weber, a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers who died tragically in Afghanistan by an attack from the Taliban. Had he received new life? Just what was going on? Before he could further question his situation, the young girl named Henrietta held his hand with tears streaming from her beautiful azure eyes. "I thought I lost you. Thank God you're alive, big brother." She then followed up her statement with the sign of the cross and a brief prayer in a language Berengar recognized as Latin. Berengar sat back in his bed and continued to ponder about his situation as the memories of Berengar's life flooded into his head. This world was an alternate Earth set in the late medieval period. His family's land was a small barony set within the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Though many historical events were similar to the world he once knew, there were still many differences. While the timeline of antiquity was mostly intact, what happened after changed drastically from the world Julian was from. The East-West schism never occurred within the Church. As such, the Orthodox and Catholic churches never drifted apart. Instead, the relationship between the two churches was rather cordial, thus the papacy held even more power than it did within our timeline. Because the Byzantines were not considered heretics by the West by the time that the Crusades were declared. When the Holy Land was retaken from the Saracens, it was granted to the Byzantine Empire as they had the most rightful claim to the land. Thus the Byzantine Empire remained a powerhouse in the Mediterranean and never suffered the massive losses from the Fourth Crusade, which eventually would lead to its destruction not too far in the future. There were many important figures from our timeline that had been replaced and many changes within the Holy Roman Empire. For example, in its current state, the Kingdom of Italy and its monarch reigned supreme. The Kingdom of Germany had become a secondary state within the empire and was on the verge of civil war as the various feudal powers contended for the throne. These were just two of the many changes to the timeline. There had been far more than Berengar could count off of the top of his head. If he truly wanted to know the major differences in the timeline and the power structure of the world, he would have to thoroughly research it in his spare time. With all these conflicts in his two sets of memories, Julian, or Berengar as he was now known, was beginning to get a headache and rubbed his temples with his fingers. Henrietta, who mistook this action as a sign of illness, immediately stopped her prayer and left the room, saying only one phrase as she rushed out the door. Her fine noble dress fluttering in her escape. "I'll go get the physician." Berengar shuddered as he heard the sentence. From what he knew of medieval medicine, he was more likely to be harmed by the treatment than cured from what ailed him. However, his throat was dreadfully dry, and he found himself unable to stop his little sister as she fled the scene, leaving Berengar alone with nothing but his thoughts and an ever-increasing headache. Chapter 2: Life as a Baron's Heir. Henrietta reappeared with the court physician not long after she had left. Though she wore an expression that showed a great deal of concern, the physician did not share her empathy. Berengar sat upright in bed, having a difficult time speaking due to how dry his throat was. Evidently, this body had sweat out most of its excess liquid while undergoing a fever. Few thought he would survive the night. The physician carefully examined Berengar and was shocked to see that the young man had recovered from the fever, as there was little hope for his survival previously. Despite being a medieval physician and having virtually no knowledge of practical medicine whatsoever, the man named Ewald showed a degree of competency after making his announcement. "No need to worry, Lady Henrietta, your brother's fever has broken, and aside from being particularly parched, he is completely healthy." After saying that, Ewald handed Berengar a glass of water and allowed the young man to drink his fill until his thirst was thoroughly quenched. After finishing the glass and wiping his mouth with his sleeve, Berengar nodded at the physician and thanked him for his service. "Thanks, Ewald. I can always count on you in my time of need." Internally, Berengar's words were insincere. However, if two lives have taught him anything, it is that it was not wise to voice your condescension aloud. Thus he acted in a civil manner befitting of a baron's heir. After hearing that her brother was healthy for the first time in a long time, Henrietta smiled ecstatically. This was wondrous news to her. Berengar had always been prone to illness, he was born with a weak constitution and a frail body. Something in which the sedentary lifestyle of a medieval noble only exacerbated. His next words startled her, as it was a question that was out of her expectations for her big brother. "Dear sister, do you mind fetching the servants and instructing them to get the bath ready? I feel as if cleansing the grime from my body would be good for my health." The physician snorted at Berengar's claims. Though baths were not uncommon for nobles, they certainly weren't as frequent of an occurrence as the modern world. Despite the physician's reaction, Berengar insisted on his request to his sister. Henrietta smiled as she responded to Berengar, "Of course, dear brother, I will go and instruct them this second." With that said, she had once more left the large stone room that belonged to Berengar and went to do as he had requested. The physician, seeing that he was no longer needed, excused himself. "I shall go and inform your father the Baron that you have recovered." Berengar nodded once more as he wore an indifferent expression. "You do that." With that having been said, Ewald left Berengar to his lonesome. Berengar sighed deeply, looking down and sniffing his clothes that reeked of sweat and filth. After grimacing from the stench, he sighed deeply. "When I inherit the title, there will be some serious changes around here." He had made up his mind that his first order of business when he came to power would be instituting laws across the barony about basic hygiene. Maybe even construct some public bathhouses like the Romans used to have. Whatever was necessary to bring a degree of cleanliness to the people of his territory. After getting out of bed and stretching his limbs for a while, he heard a knock on the door, which came from one of the family's servants. "My lord, the bath is ready." He quickly opened the door with an overexcited smile on his face, which startled the servant. "Lead the way." The servant recovered from their shock and nodded as she did as the Baron's son requested. After a short walk down the hall, Berengar reached the bathroom, where he quickly barred the doors and stripped his clothes. He carefully examined his frail body with a sense of dissatisfaction. Though not quite emaciated, there was no doubt that his bones were weak and his muscles undeveloped. He would certainly need to change his dietary habits to one rich in protein and calcium. Until he could succeed his father and implement the changes that were already brewing in his head, he must first focus on building his body up and maintaining his health. Washing away the sweat and filth that had accumulated on his body throughout his fever was a good first step. As such, he dipped his toe into the wooden bathtub to gauge its temperature before plunging his body in completely. After getting into the tub, Berengar stared at his reflection in the pool of water. He had short golden blonde hair and glistening eyes the color of the sapphire gemstone. His facial features were regal and handsome. His skin was a milky white, something that accentuated his regal demeanor. If he had not been such a sack of skin and bones, he would have come across as very princely. Though he may have reincarnated into a weak body, he did not care too much, considering he was very handsome. The body could be refined like steel, but the appearance was set in stone. After spending nearly 30 minutes in the bath washing away both the filth on his body and the mental stress that had accumulated due to the transmigration, he finally stepped out of the tub. He found a set of 15th-century nobleman's attire prepared for him. It was properly cleaned, which was the most redeeming quality of the clothing. After donning the attire, he shifted his attention to his short golden hair. Though he was no hairdresser, at the very least, he could use some of the greasy residue left on the tub to slick his hair back. He would seriously need to invent pomade to get his hair the way he liked it. After styling his hair, he left the bathroom and saw that a servant was waiting for him. "My lord, the Baron and Baroness are awaiting you in the dining hall." Berengar nodded with a stoic expression. "Lead the way." The servant bowed concerning his request. "Yes, my lord." After traversing the castle for quite some time, Berengar arrived at the dining hall where he saw his family was sitting, patiently awaiting his arrival. He quickly took his seat and noticed the meal on the table with various food to choose from. Despite being a lower noble house, the family was still wealthy enough to afford a plethora of food daily. After saying grace, Berengar quickly allotted steamed fish, baked chicken, a variety of nuts, and leafy greens, as well as a large glass of milk to his meal. He did not even make eye contact with his family as he filled his plate to the brim. He was famished and felt the desire to dig in right away. His family gazed upon him with various expressions that he overlooked right away. It was not until he lifted his gaze from his plate that he saw their looks of concern. Berengar had already cut a piece of fish and was about to stuff it into his mouth when he saw their gazes. Feeling the awkwardness of the situation, he could not help but inquire. "What is it?" Sigurd was a tall and robust man with regal facial features. He had short blonde hair, a matching beard, and sky-blue eyes. He was also Berengar's father and the Baron of Kufstein. He gazed at his son with astonishment. Until now, the young man who was his heir had been a vegetarian. Yet half of his plate was filled with fish and poultry. When asked by his son why he was surprised, he felt the answer was obvious, and as such, he made a gesture towards Berengar's plate. Berengar had a perplexed expression spread across his face. After all, he had not fully adjusted to the memories of this body yet. "Am I not allowed to eat this?" His mother, Gisela, a blonde-haired, busty beauty, looked at him with her glistening sapphire eyes in an equally perplexed manner. "You're eating meat?" Suddenly Berengar understood the meaning behind their confused expressions as he remembered that he was a vegetarian. He was starting to understand why this body he had inherited was in such poor shape. Berengar smiled at his beautiful mother and nodded. "I've decided to make some changes in my lifestyle. Starting today, I will eat meat and get some much-needed exercise. I can't go on living life as a vegetarian wastrel." A large smile spread across Sigurd's lips as he heard his son's proclamation. For too long, the boy had used his health as an excuse to be idle. It was good that he was finally growing up. He then took his fork and placed a large slab of beef on Berengar's plate. "Then eat up. You will need a full stomach." Berengar smiled and began to feast upon the well-prepared meal. Though sooner or later, he would have to discuss basic hygiene with the kitchen staff. For now, he would devour this meal with no complaints. His younger brother Lambert shared the same physical characteristics as the rest of his family. However, there was a discernible hint of malice in his ocean-blue eyes as his gaze set upon Berengar. Though Berengar was unaware of what he had done to upset the youth, he took note of such a gaze and vowed to be cautious around his brother in the future. After finishing his meal, Berengar left the dining room in a hurry. He wanted to begin his exercise regimen as quickly as possible. If he worked diligently, he could change this frail body of his into that of a soldier's within a year or less. Something he intended to get out of the way as quickly as possible. As Berengar went for a run along the castle walls, he was completely unaware of the malicious gaze set upon him from inside one of the tower spires. The gaze belonged to none other than Lambert, who bit his lip as he quietly muttered under his breath, "How are you still alive?" Chapter 3, Introducing New Technology. Berengar continued his exercise routine for some time, taking small breaks to recover when he felt his heart rate rising too high. With a complete and total lack of modern exercise equipment, the tall yet dreadfully skinny young man was forced to exercise the old-fashioned way. This exercise regimen was modeled after the U.S. Army's PT standards, albeit scaled down to a capacity in which his frail body and weak heart could handle. As he continued to persevere through a task that was incredibly difficult for the feeble body he currently inhabited, Berengar vowed that when he was able, he would draft blueprints for free weights, kettlebells, and a bench press, which he would deliver to the town smith and inquire about the feasibility of crafting such items. After all, the technological prowess of this civilization was far from what he would consider being advanced. Lambert gazed upon his sickly older brother struggle to improve himself from a tower above the castle's courtyard. A frown was spread across his face as his wicked eyes glared menacingly at sight. This sudden desire for self-improvement did not bode well for his plans. His anger only outmatched his disbelief. After all, Berengar should be dead. The poison that Lambert had used was effective enough to kill a warhorse, yet somehow Berengar was still standing, healthier than ever. All his scheming had gone to waste. The debts he had acquired to assassinate his elder brother remained unpaid, and if he could not become the heir to his father's title, he would be unable to repay them, which did not bode well for his future. However, if he were to attempt to use poison again, it would undoubtedly draw the suspicion of others, something he wished to avoid. If Lambert were to succeed his father and achieve his aspirations, he would need to devise a new assassination plot. An hour had passed, and Berengar was no longer capable of exercising. His first order of business was to bathe again and get rid of the sweat and grime accumulated over his body during his workout. The servants were perplexed as to why he desired to bathe twice in one day but followed his orders. After cleansing himself once more, Berengar returned to his room, where he sat at his desk, took out a piece of parchment, and began to design blueprints for several of the early innovations he intended to make to the industry. Though Berengar held limited authority within his father's land, he figured at the very least he could negotiate with his father about the implementation of such technology. If his father asked where he found such blueprints, he could simply say he acquired it from a trader from the Far East. After all, similar technologies should exist in China during this time period. The earlier the barony could mass-produce steel, the better it was for his plans. The Barony of Kufstein was set in the Duchy of Austria. Mountains surrounded it, and a large tributary of the Danube River flowed through it, creating fertile valleys. It was exactly because of its geographic layout that the von Kufsteins could maintain their control over the resource-rich region. If not for the natural defensive barrier that surrounded the valley where the people dwelled, then more powerful families within the empire would surely attempt to seize the region for themselves. After some time, Berengar had finished the blueprints for one of the most important inventions in steel production. Without it, the Industrial Revolution in his previous life's timeline would have never transpired. It was known in his previous life as the Bessemer converter, or the Bessemer process. Through this process, one could manufacture 3 to 5 tons of steel in a matter of 20 minutes. The Bessemer process essentially functioned by removing impurities in the iron by oxidation. It utilized airflow through the molten material to achieve this. If one lined the interior of the converter with dolomite or limestone, they could produce a greater amount of slag as the byproduct, which could be used as a cheap phosphate fertilizer. Thus, this technology aided in not only industrialization but also agriculture. All of the machine components could be manufactured by a late medieval society, and either horse or water wheel could power it. Obviously, as technology advanced, he could improve it to be powered by steam engines. However, that was a distant dream. He needed an early model built for now. High-quality steel was currently a rare commodity. With the introduction of the Bessemer process, he could achieve many things with it. The uses for high-quality steel were endless. Ultimately, Berengar would require a blast furnace to convert iron ore into pig iron, which was then converted into steel by the Bessemer process. Though in this day and age, the blast furnace should already be invented. He was certain a resource-rich region like Kufstein would already have one in its local town. If they didn't, he would simply convince his father to build one alongside the Bessemer converter. He developed a second set of blueprints for the blast furnace just in case there was not already one present in Kufstein. After finishing his blueprints and letting them dry, Berengar picked up the pieces of parchment and carefully held onto them as he approached his father's study. The sun was just beginning to set as he knocked on the sturdy oak doors. Shortly afterward, he could hear the deep voice of his father's reply. "Come in." Berengar took a deep breath and exhaled before entering his father's study. Inside the room was a large desk where his father sat behind, going over paperwork. A small library within the room covered the walls, mostly filled with books of direct importance to managing the realm's affairs. A small oil lamp was lit and sat on the desk, illuminating the increasingly dim room, and more importantly, the parchment on which the Baron was writing upon. Sieghard did not even shift his glance to his son as he focused entirely on his paperwork. This better be important. Berengar cleared his throat and presented the documents to his father, which he had spent most of the afternoon drafting. "I'd like you to take a look at these. It is of dire importance to the production of steel within our realm." Sieghard paused as he heard his son's request and placed his quill down upon the desk. He looked at his son with an interrogating gaze as if questioning whether his time would be wasted by looking over the documents. Nevertheless, he grabbed a hold of them and looked them over once or twice before placing them down and sighing. "What exactly am I looking at here?" Sieghard may have been an efficient statesman and a renowned warrior, but he did not mind engineering. As such, he needed an explanation for the blueprints. Berengar gulped down the saliva which had accumulated in his mouth and began to preach to his father about the beauty of this new invention. "Father, with this device, we will be capable of producing vast amounts of high-quality steel in a short period of 20 minutes. Not only that, but the byproduct of this device will be able to act as an efficient fertilizer to increase agricultural production." A look of shock appeared across Sieghard's face as he went over the blueprints one more time. Though he did not fully understand what he was looking at, the prospects in which Berengar boasted about were simply too good to ignore. However, a sudden question appeared in his mind as he voiced his concern. Where did you acquire this? Berengar was expecting such a question, and as such, spun a large tale of how he encountered some traveling merchant from the Far East, who had traded the blueprints with Berengar for a small fee. Though his father was skeptical of this claim, he had heard the stories of how advanced the Far Eastern countries were and thus decided to act upon Berengar's request. All right, tomorrow I will summon the best engineer in the region. If he can confirm that this technology is legitimate, then I will implement it as quickly as I am able. Berengar smiled and bowed to his father respectfully. Truthfully, this had gone better than he had thought. Thank you for listening to my request, father. With that said, Sigurd picked up his pen and returned to his paperwork. If that is all, then you are dismissed. Berengar bowed once more to the proud baron before departing from his room with a large grin spread across his face. The introduction of the Bessemer process and the blast furnace were just the first phases of his plans for modernization. His next goal would be to implement the four-field system and basic irrigation. Something which he would not be able to explain by trading with merchants. Thus, he would have to take time to visit the fields and converse with the peasantry. Yet those were his plans for the near future. For now, he intended to rest. His body was aching from the intense exercise he had forced himself through this morning, and it would not get any easier going forward. After stopping by the kitchen for a brief snack, Berengar went back to his room to rest. Before he knew it, he had actually drifted deep into sleep, dreaming about his past and current life and the events that unfolded. Chapter 4: A New Day. The light of dawn shone down through the windows of the castle's living quarters and onto Berengar's face. The moment the rays of the sunlight touched his face, he had awoken from his slumber. Sitting up while rubbing his shoulders, he yawned heavily, still tired from the previous day's workout. In fact, most of his body was sore. Nevertheless, that did not deter him from what he needed to do. Berengar quickly got dressed into some simple loose-fitting clothes and began his daily exercise, which lasted for well over an hour. He was covered in sweat by the time he returned to the castle, and his entire muscular structure was aching. Only after bathing for half an hour did he feel comfortable enough to begin today's work. His new attitude had shocked not only his family but also the servants of the castle. Waking up early, exercising, eating meat, and taking an interest in the realm's affairs were all things that Berengar had rarely participated in. After his fever broke, he had become an entirely new person in the eyes of those who knew him. This perception might not be entirely false, considering there were two sets of memories contained within Berengar's mind. Though he was unsure if he was still the same person he was before, who had simply been enlightened by the memories and knowledge that Julian possessed, or if he was actually Julian inhabiting Berengar's body. None of that truly mattered. After all, as he was concerned, his identity was that of Berengar von Kufstein, and he now had the potential to change his family's land into an industrial empire with the memories he gained from his near-death experience. Though it would take a large degree of time and effort to achieve, he was now convinced that it was his destiny to lead the Barony of Kufstein into the industrial age. Truthfully, as heir, he held little authority in the domain and could not keep lying to his father about where he came across such unique inventions. After all, the stubborn old man had not trusted his word and elected to search for an engineer who could verify the functionality of the designs. The man he was searching for had not arrived yet. Thus all Berengar could do was educate himself further on the matters of the realm. The young lord had elected to have his meal within the confines of the castle's library, where he went over important information regarding the history of the barony's finances. He was quickly dismayed by his findings. Despite being such a resource-rich region, the barons of the von Kufstein family had failed to capitalize on it. He quietly shook his head as he closed the ledger and thought to himself, "This is what happens when you leave a house of warriors to act as all-powerful administrators over a plot of land that is nearly 375 square miles in size and contains nearly 20,000 people." He knew that they were limited to medieval technology, but despite being a region notable for its iron reserves, they had barely invested in the mining of such a valuable resource. What little that was mined had been sold as ores to large cities throughout the kingdom. There were far better uses for such materials. The economy largely relied on subsistence agriculture. It was well and truly a backward feudal state. Even the nearby town was nothing more than an agricultural village with no substantial industry whatsoever. He was beginning to get a headache reading about how primitive his family's lands were. Just when he was about to curse aloud, he noticed his little sister Henrietta hiding behind one of the bookcases while staring at him from afar. He nearly let out a chuckle as he spotted the girl eyeing him like a scared rabbit. Evidently, the changes in her older brother's behavior these past few days were frightening to the young girl. She was beginning to think he had been possessed. Taking a sip from his glass of water, Berengar never shifted his attention from the ledgers he was reading. When the young girl thought she was safe from being noticed, he let out a sigh. "Henrietta, I know you're there." The young girl flinched upon hearing his words. She had been spotted by her older brother or the demon who had potentially taken his place. Thus she panicked and scrambled out of the library without saying a word. Berengar chuckled to himself as he saw the girl fleeing the scene. He could only guess what had compelled her to engage in this behavior. Nevertheless, now was not the time to concern himself with the trivial matters of children. He spent much of the day in the library studying everything from the realm's financial affairs, agricultural and mining output, as well as powers of the region. As a low-ranking member of the nobility, there were powerful lords who ruled over his father. The von Kufsteins were direct vassals to the von Habsburgs, who were the rulers of the Duchy of Austria and the County of Tyrol. Evidently, his younger brother Lambert was engaged to one of the daughters from a branch of the von Habsburg family, which was considered a great honor for the House of von Kufstein. Interestingly enough, despite being the older brother and a fully grown man, Berengar remained unmarried and unbetrothed. Largely due to concerns over his health and whether or not he'd live long enough to father a child. Berengar didn't mind such a fate. After all, in his previous life, he was a man who had completely and utterly failed to get a girlfriend well into his late 20s. Unless he made himself something of worth, he would fail to acquire a bride in this lifetime too. Though he was not concerned with such a possibility, his search for a bride would become much easier when he finally put on some muscle. By appearance alone, he was positive he could snag a beautiful bride, even if she was nothing but a commoner. Although, he highly doubted his family would consent over such a union. After all, this was still the feudal age, and nobility did not marry commoners. Berengar set such matters aside for the time being. If he was to choose his own match, he would first need authority and physicality to back up his claims that he was now healthy. Both of which were a long way away from where he currently stood. After spending the better half of the day going over the realm's affairs, he noticed that the sun had already set and thus decided now would be a good time to inquire about his father's findings on his designs. Surely he must have inquired to an engineer already. There should be at least one of them serving his father. The young lord placed the books back in their rightful places and left the library, walking down the castle's corridors until he reached the door to his father's study. Before he could even knock on it, he could overhear an unpleasant conversation between three men, one of which he recognized to be his father. "I don't care what fancy background Sir Ingbert has. I have been in the field of engineering for over 30 years, and I say the designs are brilliant. They will function exactly as your son has described, my liege." A scoff followed the old man's claim, followed by what sounded like a much younger voice. "Sire, do not listen to this crotchety old man, he's a commoner. He does not have the education in which I have received. I assure you, these designs are nothing more than scribbles from a child who thinks he knows a thing or two about engineering." Berengar could already tell by that one statement that the man who had said such a thing about the Bessemer converter was a moron relying on a lofty background to obtain his position. Ultimately, his father did not disappoint him. After hearing both of his engineers discuss the designs, let out a long sigh before asserting his authority. "Sir Ingbert, you may leave us now. I have much to discuss with my head engineer." Though Alex could not see it, he could guess the expression on the fool's face right now and smiled with satisfaction. Suddenly, the door swung open, and he was face to face with the man known as Sir Ingbert. The man was in his late 20s and had light brown hair in the form of a ponytail with green eyes. He dressed in an overly embellished doublet signaling the wealth he possessed. He was exactly the kind of pampered twat Berengar had expected to see. After examining the ring on his finger, which displayed a boar's head engraved upon it, Berengar could guess the identity of the man before him. The man's name was Ingbert Heltzer, and he was the son of one of Sieghard's knights. Just as Berengar had a guess, the man had achieved his position as one of his father's engineers solely because of his background. Even by this world's standards, Ingbert's knowledge of engineering was a joke. A pampered noble like him had no need to pay attention to his studies well enough to become competent in such a field. After seeing the young man he had just passively slandered, Ingbert's face turned sour. The last thing he wanted was to see the Baron's son standing outside the door, overhearing his discourteous remarks. Nevertheless, the damage had been done, and Berengar merely gazed upon Ingbert like he was looking at a fool. After Ingbert stormed off in a fit of rage, Berengar overheard his father's authoritative voice from behind the door. "You may enter." Evidently, the old Baron had been aware of his son's existence outside the study's door the entire time. Now that Berengar had entered the study, he found himself being gazed at intensely by his father and an old man within his late 50s who he understood to be the head engineer of the barony. With these two authorities staring him down, Berengar could not help but feel nervous, as if he was about to be scolded. Chapter 5: A Prosperous Friendship is Born. Berengar stood firmly in front of his father and the head engineer. The two stared at him intensely. Their sharp gaze could practically penetrate Berengar's soul. Especially the shrewd eyes of the old engineer. It was as if his secret had been revealed by being inspected by those old discerning eyes. Finally, the tension was eased as a smile broke across the old engineer's face as he bowed respectfully to Berengar. "My lord, I am Ludwig, a humble servant of your family. Your father asked me here to verify the authenticity of these blueprints." Berengar nodded at Ludwig with a dignified visage. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Ludwig. I have a feeling we will see a lot of each other very soon." Though the message was cryptic, Ludwig took the statement as proof of his theory that the designs presented to him by the Baron were not from a merchant from the Far East but rather drafted by the idle and infirm heir who was almost universally scorned throughout the court. It would appear the boy was more clever than he had initially estimated. Nevertheless, the sly old man did not let his inner thoughts appear upon his face, and instead, he merely graciously returned the young lord's words to him. Likewise, seeing that his son and Ludwig had become acquainted, Sigurd smiled. He had a feeling working with the stubborn old engineer would be of great benefit to Berengar's development. Completely unaware that his son was the true designer of those blueprints, Sigurd decided he would allow the two of them to converse for some time without his presence. He found the subject of engineering to be dreadfully boring and usually just left such matters up to Ludwig to implement as he saw fit. "I'm quite busy with managing the realm. I suggest you answer Ludwig's questions to the best of your abilities." Berengar nodded as he replied, "Yes, father." Afterward, Sigurd led the two men out of the study and secluded himself inside. Once sitting at his desk, he opened a compartment and took out a wineskin, and began to engage in the age-old tradition of drinking your stress away. After dealing with that fool Ingbert, he needed it. Outside the closed door of the study, Berengar found himself alone with Ludwig. As such, he suggested they find a better place to discuss the important matters before them. "How about we go to the library? I will have some servants fetch us some food and wine. I promise to answer all the questions you have to the best of my ability." Ludwig nodded his head in approval of Berengar's suggestion. The boy proved to be more thoughtful than he had given him credit for. He looked forward to inquire about the true origins of those designs. After reaching the library and secluding themselves within, they partook of food and wine and discussed trivial matters for the first half hour. Only after they were sufficiently buzzed did Ludwig ask about his most pressing concern. "So tell me the truth, kid, where did those designs really come from?" Berengar chuckled at the old man's question. He had suspected that the old man had guessed the true nature of the origin of the blueprints. "I made them." A serious expression appeared on Ludwig's face, as Berengar had suspected. The old man was not the least bit surprised to hear it, nor did he find the idea preposterous. However, what came from Berengar's lips next truly astounded him. "Though I surmise you already knew that." Cunning, that was the only word Ludwig could use to describe Berengar at this moment. Was this truly the weak and petty heir everyone had known? Had the boy been hiding his real intelligence all along? After taking a long sip from his wine, the old engineer inquired further. "Do you have any more brilliant designs?" Berengar tapped the lip of the chalice thrice and tilted his head to the side as he appeared to enter deep thought. After a moment had gone by, he responded honestly to Ludwig. "A few." Ludwig nearly jumped out of his chair in excitement upon hearing the news. There was only one thing the old man truly enjoyed in life, and that was engineering. To think that the boy he and many others had cast aside believing him to be a weak and petty person was actually so brilliant. However, before he could get out of his chair, Berengar raised his hand, signaling him to stop. I will give you the designs to implement in the future when they're necessary. For now, we should focus on building the blast furnace and the Bessemer converter. Ludwig was perplexed for a moment as to Berengar's thinking before he realized the greatest concern. New designs were great in theory, but investing in them required significant financial support. Something in which the Barony of Kufstein completely lacked at the moment. After calming down his heart, he sat back in his seat and put his hands together. So, I assume you have a plan? Berengar took a sip from his chalice once more before a grin spread across his lips as he answered Ludwig's question with one of his own. How much do you think 5 tons of pure steel ingots are worth? Though he could not do that calculation off the top of his head, he knew it would be no small amount. One could even call it a small fortune. But that was just at first. The more steel they produced, the less valuable it would be over time. However, as his thoughts came to such a conclusion, he instantly knew what Berengar's intent was. You want to sell the first batch and use the profits to invest in mining? The smile on Berengar's lips continued to curl. Further, his assumptions about the man known as Ludwig were correct. Despite being born a commoner, the man had a quick mind and a lifetime of experience in the related fields to what Berengar wished to accomplish. He would be a valuable ally to have in the future. Precisely, once our mines are operating at full capacity, the raw materials that come out of the mountains will be used primarily for our own industrial purposes. Any surplus we may have will be turned into ingots and sold to the Empire for profit. Ludwig could not believe his ears. Iron in and of itself was a valuable and rare commodity that most regions were constantly in need of. Steel was much more difficult to produce and was mostly used to craft weapons such as swords or in rare cases armor for the nobility. He could not imagine having a surplus of steel, especially after taking into account their own needs. Nevertheless, Berengar's ambitions were truly great. He intended to use his family's resource-rich territory to spring his sphere of influence into an industrial age. All while making a profit from the scraps left behind by selling them at great cost to the kingdom. It would take years, but he was positive he would see such an era in his lifetime and still have enough time to enjoy it. Though he did not reveal the entirety of his plans to Ludwig, as Berengar knew without seeing it for himself, the old man would never be able to dream of a world of industry. Instead, he reached out his arm in a friendly gesture to the old engineer and asked the question on his mind. Will you help me bring this barony into a new age of industry? Ludwig could hardly believe his ears. The petty and weak lord he had always heard rumors about was asking a commoner like himself for help in creating a steel production industry within his family's land. Even though the boy's father valued Ludwig's opinion, the old man was still looked down upon for being a mere commoner. Yet here, Berengar stood with his hand extended, asking, not ordering him to help him in his endeavors. The old man could not help but feel a small tear welling in his right eye. If only everyone knew how wrong they were about this young lord. As such, he grasped a hold of Berengar's hand and shook it firmly. I could do that. With that, a prosperous friendship would be born between a young lord and an old engineer. A duo that together would bring many innovations in the following months, which would yield great prosperity and stability to an otherwise impoverished barony within a kingdom filled with turmoil. Chapter 6: A seemingly civil discussion. Within a fertile valley, surrounded by the Alps mountains, lies the inhabited region of the Barony of Kufstein. A large tributary for the Danube River flowed through the valley, the crisp blue water providing life to all beings within the region. As the light of dawn shone upon the harmonious territory, the rooster's cries awoken the peasant class to the beginning of a long day of hard work. Though the nobility tended to sleep longer than the common folk in which they presided over, one young lord had risen simultaneously as the peasants to get in his morning exercise. If Berengar wished to overcome his natural infirmity, then he would have to work twice as hard as the average knight in terms of physical fitness, and so he did. The night prior, he had already discussed with Ludwig to construct a set of free weights and kettlebells to assist in his daily training. Ludwig was well respected within the local town and had contacts in every trade. Thus he did his new friend a favor and sent the designs to the local blacksmith who would craft the exercise equipment at a fair price in which Ludwig was in charge of negotiating. Though the equipment had not been constructed yet, as the technology of this feudal world was still far from developed, it would only be a matter of time before Berengar could enhance his strength training further. Nevertheless, he still did all that he could manage with his limited resources. After another morning of hard training, Berengar found himself bathing again. His bathing habits were starting to provoke the servants' curiosity within the castle. He would bathe once in the morning after his exercise and once before going to sleep at night. He tried to persuade his family to adopt the practice, but they were stubborn people set in their old traditions. Though they would bathe relatively frequently for the time period, they still could not match Berengar's borderline germophobic tendencies. Nevertheless, he had commanded the entirety of the staff to wash their hands every time they used the restroom or engaged in any activity which might dirty one's hands. He became known for especially scolding the cooking staff when he found their cleaning habits had not matched his desires. Though the Baron did not chastise Berengar for his behavior, he became concerned about the boy's newfound habits. Henrietta was the only exception in the family. Being the obedient little sister, she took up all of Berengar's hygiene suggestions. She had even begun bathing right before she slept. This made Berengar exceptionally happy, as the likelihood of his little sister catching serious illness was significantly lower if she practiced proper hygiene. The more he thought about it, the more he knew he would have to construct public baths. It would take quite some time on his path of industrialization for the entirety of the populace within his family's domain to be able to afford a private bath. Truly, the ancient Romans were far ahead of the medieval period when it came to things like cleanliness. After completing his first bath for the day, Berengar styled his hair to the best of his ability. He currently lacked the means to acquire pomade, which in his previous life he had made extensive use of to slick back his hair. He found it to be a dignified appearance, fitting an officer in the military and even better suited to a young lord. For now, he merely made it into a side part with his brush. The next time he visited the town, he would be sure to buy some lard, which was the main ingredient for the construction of pomade. After styling his hair and dressing in a fashionable outfit currently in style, he set forth to the dining hall. Truthfully, he preferred the fashion of the 16th century, especially that of the Tudors in England. He would be sure to implement such culture in due time. For now, he would endure the dress of an early 15th century German nobleman. After entering the dining hall, he noticed his family was all seated waiting for him. This had become a recent custom, as Berengar usually spent quite some time enjoying the bath, a considerable time for a man with memories from 21st century America. Nevertheless, in this filthy era, he never felt more comfortable than when he was bathing. After sitting down at the table and saying grace, he noticed that Lambert eyed him with malicious intent once more. It was subtle, and if not for 2 lifetimes' worth of experience, Berengar would not be privy to such a gaze. Yet it was all too frequent of behavior for Lambert. He would speak gracefully with a smile on his face, all while having eyes filled with hatred and murderous intent. Berengar was starting to suspect that the frequency of his illness had something to do with Lambert. It was not uncommon for siblings to assassinate one another for the inheritance in a time like this. The more he examined Lambert's behavior, the more he began to question his motives. Unfortunately for Berengar, he had been isolated from the court and had no real friends among the nobility. Rather, they were all in Lambert's corner. After all, until recently, Lambert had always been the shining star of the von Kufstein family. He was talented with the sword, relatively intelligent, and highly charismatic. Lambert even managed to win the heart of the Count of Tyrol's eldest daughter and convince her father to approve of their engagement. Berengar could think of half a dozen nobles within the county of Tyrol who would side with Lambert if he requested their help in the assassination of his older brother. The more he thought about it, the more Berengar knew he would have to be careful in the future. He decided to spend some of his time establishing ties with the nobility of the region. However, his primary focus was winning the hearts of the people. He was confident that with his plans to advance agriculture and industry, the people would never want to see him replaced as their sovereign. While the nobles looked down upon the common folk as if they were mere slaves incapable of rising against their masters. Berengar had the memories of Julian, and the history of Julian's timeline proved that the wrath of the common folk is something all tyrants should fear. With the military innovations he would bring with his rise to power, the era of knights would become a thing of the past. Henrietta stared at Berengar with a hint of caution in her beautiful azure eyes. She was well aware her beloved older brother was acting strangely ever since his fever broke. She had even pondered the feasibility of possession, though he never acted malignantly. The sudden change in his personality had shocked her. Yet despite all of this, she still obeyed his every suggestion. If she were aware of Lambert's attempt on Berengar's life, she might murder the poor boy in his sleep. Luckily for the family, his treachery had not been revealed, nor was anyone but Berengar suspicious of Lambert's behavior. As the family ate, Sigurd broke the silence. Curious about Berengar's conversation with Ludwig the night prior, he decided to inquire about it. "So Berengar, my boy, how did your discussion with Ludwig go last night?" Berengar gracefully ate the grilled fish before him. After wiping his mouth with his napkin, he looked over at his father with a dignified expression as he recounted the events of the night prior. "Rest assured, father, the project will break ground as soon as possible. Ludwig needs to gather the necessary labor to complete the task. I fully trust in his abilities." Sigurd sighed in relief before a satisfied expression spread across his visage. He was relieved that his son's sudden change in behavior was not just a whim and was excited about the prospects of this new technology. The news aggrieved only one person within the room, and that was Lambert. The cunning youth quickly put on a mask of innocent confusion as he investigated the details. "Project? What project? Is something wonderful happening?" Everyone at the table had bought into the innocent facade of the scheming youth. Everyone except Berengar, that is, in his past life, had been cheated by too many frauds and had developed a sixth sense for detecting such falsehoods over time. Though Lambert was a good actor, it was not enough to trick Berengar's discerning eye. This boy, who was not even 16, was truly devious. Sigurd was happy that his second son was also interested in the realm's affairs and was more than happy to share the plan to construct the improved blast furnace and the Bessemer converter. "My son, your elder brother, had brought to my attention some interesting plans for developing the steel industry within our realm. With this new technology, we will be able to develop steel far more efficiently." A look of pride was on Sigurd's face as he revealed the plan Berengar had come up with without a hint of discretion. Though Lambert smiled at the news, he was internally furious. Just where did Berengar come up with such technology? Why was I not informed of this? Damn it. I have serious plans for the iron ore within my mountains. These were just a few of the thoughts that had crossed the youth's mind as he stared down his elder brother, who had always been so foolhardy. Though what he did not expect was that Berengar returned his stare with narrowed eyes. The gaze was cold. Though not murderous, it had a hint of savagery within it. The eyes of a man who was aware he had been plotted against and would surely return the favor at the first opportunity. The sight of which frightened Lambert terribly. These were not the eyes of the carefree and naive older brother he had grown up with. However, before he could investigate further, Berengar had finished his meal and stood up from the table. After wiping his mouth with his napkin, Berengar shifted his gaze from Lambert and put on an equally convincing facade to their father. "Father, may I be excused? I have urgent business to attend to with Ludwig." A gracious smile spread across Sigurd's face as he had no idea of the rivalry that was brewing between his two sons. "Of course, my son, go. I wish you the best of luck with this endeavor." Berengar bowed before leaving the dining room, leaving Lambert and the family with various expressions. Lambert's right hand, which wielded the dining knife, began to tremble as his mind could not unsee the narrowed eyes of Berengar, which appeared to have seen past his facade and peered deep into his soul. The trembling of his hand did not go unnoticed by the family as his mother, Gisela, spoke up with a hint of concern on her face. "Lambert, your hand is shaking. Are you all right?" "Yes." Lambert looked down at his hand and noticed it trembling for the first time. As he examined it, the cold sapphire eyes of Berengar once more entered his vision, and his hand instinctively dropped the knife. As he grabbed a hold of his hand to steady himself, he spoke up to assure his family. "I'm fine. I'm just feeling a little under the weather, is all. If you would excuse me, I think I'm going to go lie down for a bit." After being excused by his family, Lambert gracefully left the dining hall, though when he was no longer in sight, he frantically sprinted to his room and latched the door behind him. After entering the large stone room, he collapsed against the door, shielding his eyes with his hands, muttering under his breath, "What devil has possessed my brother to make him aware of my schemes?" The trembling youth could not help but feel like his plot to assassinate his older brother had succeeded and invited a demon into their midst. Chapter 7: A Passion for Engineering. As Berengar left the dining room and his family behind before Lambert's outburst, he could not witness the scene of his scheming brother scared to the bone. Instead, he had already headed to his room to draft new blueprints. He felt as if Ludwig could be trusted and willing to take the credit for the inventions if he asked. As such, he spent the next hour drafting plans for a beehive oven, which was the best method currently available for turning coal into coke, something which would prove to be vital in the functioning of the blast furnaces. After drafting the plans, he quickly left the castle's gates and entered the town below. The von Kufstein family's castle sat atop a large hill in the center of the town. It was a well-fortified castle that the family had occupied for generations. They presided over the barony with absolute authority. They answered only to their lieges, the von Habsburgs, who ruled not only the county of Tyrol but also the Duchy of Austria. Though at this point, a cadet branch of the Habsburg family ruled over the county of Tyrol, where Innsbruck was their seat of power. The Count of Tyrol had agreed to Lambert's proposal to marry his eldest daughter. Even Berengar was slightly envious of such a thing. Not only was she a gorgeous young woman who still had time to grow into her natural beauty, but she was also the Count's daughter, a prestige many young noblemen sought after. Berengar had no idea what schemes Lambert had conspired to achieve such a thing. After all, it was unusual for a count to marry off one of his daughters to a lower nobleman, let alone the second son of a lowly baron. Nevertheless, the boy had achieved it. Even Berengar had to give him props. Lambert was not even 16 years old, yet he had conned a count into pledging his daughter's hand to him. Meanwhile, Berengar was single, without the slightest prospect of marriage in mind due to his feeble constitution. Though that would change soon enough, and maybe one day he too could marry a count's daughter. As soon as he thought up of such glamorous ideals, he laughed aloud. What was he thinking? He had far more important matters to attend to. Realistically speaking, the likelihood of him pulling off such a thing would be slim, and he'd rather not bother with the politics of the nobility. If Berengar could bring prosperity and power to his family's land through the might of industry and agriculture that was good enough for him, he truly did not care for the lavish schemes of the upper nobility. His ambitions stopped at inheriting his birthright and bringing his family's territory to a better age. With his knowledge of military tactics and advanced weaponry, he would be able to defend his borders from any threat, though conquering other regions was easier said than done, and he had no desire to wage wars for the rest of his life. For now, his ambitions had to wait. He had yet to gain any authority over the Barony of Kufstein, and as such, had to make do with what he was capable of. After arriving at the door to Ludwig's shop, he could overhear the old man yelling at someone else within. This was not the first time he had overheard Ludwig's temper, and if Berengar was guessing correctly, then the voice in which he was arguing with belonged to Esser Ingbert. Something which Berengar dreaded having to deal with. He was not a fan of pompous fools who overestimated their worth, especially when the reasoning for their hubris was because of some noble title they inherited from their father. Though Ingbert could not directly offend Berengar, it did not prevent him from acting like a jerk to Ludwig. As the heated discussion reached a degree of incivility that Berengar could no longer tolerate, he threw open the doors to the shop, making his presence known to all inside. Before the two men could greet him, Berengar barked his commands at Ingbert. Out, S. A devilish smirk appeared across Ingbert's face after mistaking Berengar's command as if it were meant for the lowly commoner beside him. You heard the young lord, leave us. Berengar glared at Ingbert coldly. He was a man with good control of his temper, but Ingbert's incapability to read the room thoroughly agitated him. I was referring to you. The wicked smile on Ingbert's face suddenly turned into a confused expression as he pointed to himself, asking for clarification. Me? Berengar glared fiercely at Ingbert in silence, as if the young knight was trying his patience with every second he remained in the room. After a few moments of gawking at Berengar like an idiot, the young knight finally understood what he had meant and bowed his head respectfully. Though his tone was pleasant, his eyes were furious. He had never been scolded in such a way before. He would remember this humiliation until his dying breath. After bowing to Berengar, Ingbert left the shop behind where Ludwig was by himself, scratching the back of his head. You didn't need to do that. Berengar quickly approached the old man and slapped him on the back. Nonsense, his presence would only hinder our plans. Besides, I have a new set of blueprints for you. Like a child at the candy store, Ludwig's eyes glowed with excitement. He reached for the blueprints in Berengar's hands but was taken aback when the young lord withdrew his hand out of reach. Not so fast. I have one condition. Ludwig frowned as he heard the young lord's words. For a second, he felt as if he were going to be cheated by Berengar, that is until he heard the condition. I need you to take credit for its invention. Ludwig's mouth nearly fell agape as he heard Berengar's words. He had never expected the Baron's son to request him to take the glory for inventing what he knew would most likely be a critical piece in the steel industry. After careful deliberation, Ludwig agreed. He did not need to know why Berengar shifted the invention into his hands. After all, it probably included some convoluted court schemes with which he wanted nothing to do with. If his 57 years alive had taught him anything, it's that it is best to avoid the affairs of noblemen. All right, that's fine by me. Berengar smiled, partially because the man agreed to his request but also because he had not inquired why he wanted to shift the invention to Ludwig's name. The man was much more intelligent than a fool like Ingbert would ever be. After handing over the blueprint to Ludwig, the man could no longer contain his excitement. A huge beaming smile spread across his face. Inside the blueprint was a series of notes about converting coal into coke and how coke was a more efficient fuel source for the blast furnace than charcoal. Luckily for them, the mountains that surrounded the Barony of Kufstein were not just filled with iron but coal as well. You are a genius, my lord. Berengar smiled at Ludwig's response. Though he was brilliant in his past life, he was far from what he would consider a genius, but here in this primitive world, he was most likely the most knowledgeable man on the planet. He was glad to see someone appreciated his intellect. So, how quickly can you put those 3 designs into production? Ludwig scratched his beard at the question. He too desperately desired to make the blueprints into reality. After careful deliberation, he raised a single finger. Give me a month, and I promise you that I will have at least one of each of these designs built within the town. Berengar was pleased with the news. It was much quicker than he had anticipated. He was fairly certain by the look on the old man's face that he would run himself ragged building these inventions. Nevertheless, Berengar did not stop him. He only left a few words of encouragement. Make sure to take care of yourself. I will drop by every once in a while to check up on your progress. If you need any additional funding, just ask my father about it. I'm sure he will manage to find the funds needed to make this dream of ours a reality. After all, these designs greatly concern the matter of the realm's future finances. Ludwig grinned and gave a thumbs up to Berengar. He was happy to have a partner who understood his passion for engineering. Even his own son did not express the same degree of excitement for this project as Berengar did. You can count on me, partner. With that said, Berengar excused himself from Ludwig's workshop. Now that the initial stage of the industry within his plans had been set on the right path, he would focus on expanding the agricultural capabilities of the barony for the next month. Truly, a lord's work is never finished. Chapter 8-4 Field System. After returning from Ludwig's shop, Berengar spent the rest of his waking hours for the day perfecting agricultural designs. The first improvement he would have to make for the agricultural system of Kufstein would be the 4-field system, which was instrumental in sustaining a large population. Currently, the 3-field system was in use, which essentially operated as a form of crop rotation that left one field empty or fallow and used the other 2 fields to grow oats, beans, wheat, and rye. The 4-field system was a huge advantage that led to the agricultural and industrial revolutions. If this world were left to its own devices, it would be centuries until they naturally developed such a crucial system. The 4-field system was like it sounded. It had 4 fields divided into legumes, roots, leaves, and fruit. This allowed for an increase in food production. Due to the legumes and roots, the soil would maintain or increase its fertility over time. On top of all of these things, it also allowed for the continued growth of food stock for livestock, allowing them to be bred year-round, as certain roots like turnips and beets were notoriously hardy plants capable of being grown during the winter season. Berengar intended to fully implement the 4-field system within the next month. Especially considering that after a month from now, he will have access to a quality phosphate fertilizer which will only increase the yield of his crops. If all went as planned this year, they would be able to have ample food storage. Within a few years, the Barony of Kufstein might even become the breadbasket of Austria. After spending time drafting the plans for agriculture, Berengar noticed that the sun had long since passed. It was late at night now, and it was just about time for him to take a bath and head to bed. After all, he had a lot of work that needed to be done tomorrow. However, just as he was about to ask the servants to prepare a bath for him, Berengar heard a slight knock on his door. Cautious that it might be another ploy from his brother Lambert, Berengar inquired about the individual's identity before opening his door. "Who is it?" The response surprised him. It was a meek and feminine voice, one that still held the high-pitched tone of a child. "It's me." Berengar immediately recognized the voice to belong to his little sister Henrietta, who had only recently turned 10, thus advancing into the very beginning of adolescence. A warm smile spread across his face as Berengar approached the door and opened it. In the doorway stood a little girl dressed in an extravagant pink nightgown and holding onto an old rag doll that had been in her hands since birth. It was her favorite toy and also her best friend. Though the doll had aged poorly, the dress was of exquisite make, and Berengar immediately questioned how his family could afford such frivolities after having inspected the ledgers. It appeared his father was deeply concerned about appearances and wasted money on luxurious clothing. Nevertheless, Berengar looked at Henrietta with questionable eyes. It was late at night, she should already be asleep by now. Why was she at his doorway? His paranoia took hold, and he did not leave the room, merely peeking out of the narrowly opened door. "What's wrong?" Henrietta held her doll tightly to her chest as a worrisome look spread across her doll-like face. "I can't sleep. Can you tell me a story?" Berengar sighed. He had intended to take a bath and then get some sleep, but it appeared his little sister needed him. After all, he was grateful to have a little sister. In his previous life, Berengar, or Julian as he was known then, was an only child, so he desired to get along with his new siblings. However, Lambert had already made that an impossibility in his case. On the other hand, Henrietta was different. She appeared to have a good relationship with Berengar. As such, he was more than happy to tell her a story. After walking out of the door, he began to take off in the direction of Henrietta's room. However, he quickly noticed Henrietta had stayed behind in his doorway. Confused about her actions, he immediately turned around and asked about it. "Henrietta, why are you still standing there?" The young girl stiffened up at her big brother's response and peered down the long corridor with a petrified look on her face. "The hallways are scary at night." After seeing her too scared to move, Berengar backtracked to her location and grabbed a hold of her small hand as he led the little girl to her room. Though he could not see it, the girl smiled as she walked down the hallway hand in hand with her big brother. She concluded then and there that she had been overthinking things. He was still the same kind and caring older brother she had always known. After arriving at her room, Berengar opened the door and walked the girl to her bed, where he picked her up and tucked her in. For a second, he forgot how frail his body was and struggled dearly to accomplish the deed. After tucking the girl into her bed where she was comfortable, Berengar began to spin the tale of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans who had protected Greece from a Persian invasion at Thermopylae Pass. Truthfully, he did not know if that was historically accurate in this world or not, but it did not matter. It was an interesting story of the heroism and bravery of man regardless of if it were true or not. Only after the girl had fallen asleep did he end his story. Seeing the girl fast asleep, he kissed her on the forehead. "Sweet dreams, my dear sister." After parting from her room, he immediately informed the servants to prepare a bath for him. After they had finished, he thoroughly enjoyed it before heading back to his quarters and sleeping himself. The night would go by peacefully, the sun would rise, and the rooster would crow, awaking the peasant class, as well as Berengar, who once more engaged in his daily exercise routine. After finishing his exercise and taking his morning bath, Berengar had breakfast with his family once more. After finishing his meal, he directly headed to town. He had two purposes in his visit today. One was to form a relationship with the local farmers, and another was to buy lard and lots of it. He was going to invent pomade even if it killed him. He was sick and tired of parting his hair. He would rather slick it back like he used to do in his past life. After reaching the town, Berengar approached the nearest farm, where he saw a man in his 30s operating the plow as he began to make ready for planting. After all, it was early spring, and the time to begin planting had just begun. Berengar took notice of the man who was hard at work and decided to approach him. "Excuse me, what is your name?" The man saw that Berengar was speaking and looked around to see who he might be speaking to until he realized he was the only one in the vicinity. He carefully lifted a finger and pointed at himself with a jaw slightly ajar, gawking at Berengar as he could not fathom the baron's son speaking to a lowly peasant like him. "Yes, you. How may I refer to you?" "My lord, my name is Gunther." Berengar reflected upon the name for a moment and smiled at the large and burly man as he complimented him. Gunther, a strong name, it surely suits you. I am Berengar. It is a pleasure to meet you. Gunther could not believe his ears. The Baron's son and heir said it was a pleasure to meet him, a lowly peasant. How could this be? He accidentally voiced his thoughts and immediately winced, expecting retaliation. A pleasure to meet me? How? Berengar's smile froze. He did not realize the peasant class had so little sense of self-worth. He would clearly have to explain to the man how important his job is. Of course it is a pleasure. I see a man desperately plowing the field in the dawn of spring, working hard to ensure that the realm has enough food to eat, to survive the winter, and to prosper as a region. I can't help but feel proud to meet a hard-working individual such as yourself. He was not lying. In his previous life, Berengar had seen too many slackers succeed in life because of their connections, while hardworking men lived a life of poverty and daily struggle. He could not help but admire a hardworking and competent man who provided for his family, despite the horrible conditions a medieval peasant endured, which would drive a modern man to suicide. After hearing the young lord's kind words, Gunther was truly shocked. The man's reputation was well known throughout these parts, even by the peasant class. Despite this, when meeting him for the first time, Berengar was nothing like what Gunther had expected him to be. Berengar could see that Gunther was amazed by his behavior. Thus, he shifted the direction of the conversation in his favor. Tell me, Gunther, have you ever thought of using 4 fields instead of 3? Gunther nearly scoffed at the young lord's remark. He may be the Baron's son, but he knows nothing of agriculture, something Gunther and his family had been doing for centuries. My lord, with all due respect, if we were to use 4 fields, then the soil would erode and eventually be useless. A smirk appeared on Berengar's face. This wasn't just a farmer who learned what his forefathers taught and did not understand the underlying principles of why it was so. At least in terms of his profession, this was an educated farmer, someone who clearly understood why one should not do as Berengar had suggested. If I were to tell you that if you created a 4-field rotation separated into the category wheat, turnips, barley, and clover, would it not solve such a problem? He was testing Gunther's knowledge of his craft. After all, Berengar had no use for fools who did what they were told because that was the tradition. He needed thinkers, men who could grasp a hold of new technologies and implement them on his behalf. Defying all odds, the first farmer he came across was such a man. Gunther's eyes lit up. It was already well known that legumes could enhance the soil of the fields they were planted in. Thus, they were already used in the 3-field system. However, the more he thought about Berengar's words, the more he realized the young lord was correct. If they used these 4 crops as the staple of their agricultural system, they would be able to maintain or possibly increase the fertility of the soil while growing food year-round and sustaining the breeding of livestock throughout the year. The poor farmer gazed at Berengar with a new sense of admiration. However, what Berengar said next shocked the man to the core. I see you approve, then come, let us introduce this innovation together. Afterward, Berengar dismounted from his horse, rolled up his sleeves, and picked up a hoe where he stood aside Gunther and worked alongside a lowly peasant to introduce the agricultural innovation that would bring the Barony of Kufstein into an agricultural revolution. Despite his natural infirmity, he helped plow and seed the field throughout the entire day alongside the poor farmer. By the end of the hard day's worth of labor, the 4-field system was implemented on this single farm, and Berengar was exhausted beyond his limits. Yet, he was satisfied on a deeply personal level. The life of a pampered noble was ill-suited for a man such as himself. Gunther stared at the young lord in disbelief. Nobody in the entire village, not even his wife nor his kids, would believe he had just plowed and seeded a field alongside the Baron's son and heir. Thus an unlikely friendship between a lowly peasant farmer and a young lord was born. One which would last a lifetime. Chapter 9: A fair day's wage for a fair day's work. After a hard day's work, Berengar sat down next to the poor farmer known as Gunther and shared a wineskin with the man as he wiped away the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his luxurious doublet. As the two rehydrated, Berengar suddenly remembered his most important reason for entering the fields. As important as advancing the agricultural technology of his family's land was, there was one matter that truly kept him awake at night. Hey Gunther, do you have about a pound of lard I may purchase from you? That's right, lard. No matter how important advancing the agricultural system of his family's land was, It was a process that would take many years, possibly even decades, to fulfill truly. Right now, he desperately needed lard to create pomade so he could get his appearance the way he desired. I mean, sure, his family probably had lard in its kitchen, but the cooks were awfully stingy about the resources he could take out on a whim. If he kept stockpiling lard, sooner or later, he would have to explain to his father that he was using it to create a primitive hair gel. Only once did he use the greasy residue from his natural grime to fix his hair, and he immediately regretted it. The entire day, he felt grossed out knowing that the sweat and dirt produced by his body were used to style his hair. It was simply unsanitary. After the first day of his transmigration, he opted never to resort to such filthy habits ever again. Thus he had been parting his hair ever since and felt it did not fit of this handsome face he had acquired. Gunther had a hard time believing this young lord's behavior. Even now, after helping a lowly peasant like himself plow and seed his fields for the entire day, the baron's son was asking to purchase lard off of him instead of outright confiscating it. "My lord, all of this land belongs to your family. Everything I produce belongs to." Before Gunther could finish his thought, Berengar raised a hand and cut him off. With a dignified expression, Berengar smiled at Gunther and preached his ideology. "I'm a strong believer of the saying a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. You tell me what you think the lard you have put so much effort into producing is worth, and I will pay it." Gunther stared at Berengar with an astonished look. He had never met such an enlightened noble before, yet what Berengar said next was like a dream come true for a lowly peasant such as himself. "One day, when I rule over these lands, I will pay every man the worth of their labor, regardless of the class they were born into." A small tear formed in Gunther's eyes as he heard the pleasant words of Berengar. If this were an ordinary nobleman, he would never believe such an outrageous statement. Yet, Berengar, a man with obvious physical frailty and of noble birth, had stood side by side with him, helping him plow and seed his fields so that together they could introduce a new system of crop rotation. The noble scion did it without demanding for anything in return. After considering Berengar's offer for quite some time, raised 3 of his fingers. 3 pfennigs. Berengar thought it was a fair price. As such, he reached into his doublet and pulled out a small satchel which contained a pouch of small white coins. He pinched 3 of the small coins with his fingers and pulled them out of the satchel, handing them over to Gunther with a smile on his face. Gunther, on the other hand, was staring madly at the 3 white coins. When he was said 3 pfennigs, he referred to the copper pfennigs, not the white ones, which contained at least 50% silver within the metallic mix. These were worth far more than he had asked for. After gaping at Berengar like an idiot for a few moments, he finally recovered from his daze and handed them back to the young lord. "My lord, when I said 3 pfennigs, I was referring to the copper ones, not the white ones." Berengar looked at Gunther with a look of confusion on his face. In his entire memories, the young nobleman had only ever encountered the white pfennigs. He was entirely unaware that a separate currency with the same name existed and was worth far less. After hearing such a thing existed, Berengar couldn't help but feel disgruntled. He could not believe the currency used in this society was primitive. He would investigate this at once and develop a plan to rehash the currency used in this feudal society. He swore even if he had to create his own currency, he would fix this backward system that Kufstein currently used. Luckily for him, this would be within his power as the Baron of Kufstein when he succeeded his father. Much like during the timeline of his previous life, sometime during the 12th century, the German king was no longer able to enforce the regalia of minting coins. Thus the minting process fell to the authority of every local town and lord. The value of a coin from one barony could be worth more or less than the value from another. It was truly a maddening system. However, if you thought the Kingdom of Germany was a mess, then the Holy Roman Empire as a whole was far worse. There was no uniform currency throughout the entirety of its territory. While the Kingdom of Germany and its domains used the pfennig, or penny as it would be translated to in modern English as the most common currency, the same could not be said about the other kingdoms the empire comprised of. Though he may be a baron, at the very least, he could simplify the coinage minted in his territory when he came to power. However, for now, he had to endure the stupidity of such a foolish system. After thinking it through, Berengar folded Gunther's hand, which currently held the 3 pfennigs, and smiled. 3 pfennigs is 3 pfennigs as far as I'm concerned. When I come to power, I will mint new currency, made of solid gold and silver so that its value is absolute. It did not take Berengar long to come up with a new system. After all, he had the memories of his past life, and eventually, Germany got its act together and minted pfennigs and marks. Marks were made out of gold, while pfennigs were made out of various materials and eventually lost their value almost entirely. However, he would not be foolish enough to compromise the integrity of his coinage. As such, he vowed to make all pfennigs made out of silver and all marks made out of gold. In a time like this, with such a small population, such a currency system would work well domestically and in trade with other regions. Gunther eventually came to accept the excessive price and delivered the lard in a ceramic jar to Berengar. He couldn't help but be curious about why Berengar needed a pound of lard when his family's kitchen would be filled with it. Once again, Gunther voiced his thoughts aloud, though this time, when he realized what he had done, he only slightly flinched as he was aware of Berengar's character at this point. After his instinct took hold, he could hear Berengar chuckle at him. "You will know when you next see me." With that, Berengar placed the jar in one of his horse's saddlebags and hopped upon it as he waved goodbye to Gunther. "I will see you again soon, my friend, but for now, I need to retire for the evening." After which, Berengar slapped his spurs against the exquisite destrier's torso and rode off towards the castle's gates. By the time he arrived at the gates, the beautiful orange sunset which filled the sky had already begun to fade, along with the light of day. His first order of business was to take a bath as quickly as possible. However, upon entrance, he was immediately greeted by his little sister Henrietta, who jumped into his arms and wiped her face against his sweaty torso. A smudge of dirt and grime appeared on the young girl's face as she looked up to her brother in his arms, pouting as she did so. "You're late and dirty," she said coldly as she stared daggers at Berengar. It was unlike him to come home so late. Not only did he rarely leave the castell's walls, but he had never returned in such a pitiful condition before. She could only imagine what trouble he had gotten himself into. Berengar laughed as he petted the young girl's head. "I appreciate you are worrying about me, but I'm fine. I just had some business to take care of." Henrietta looked at what Berengar was holding, and her eyes filled with curiosity. "What's that?" she exclaimed as she pointed at the ceramic jar in his hands. Berengar was more than happy to answer his curious little sister. "Lard." The young girl touched her lips with her finger with a questioning gaze. She had not heard the word before and was curious what it meant. "Lard?" Berengar smirked with a devilish grin. He decided to tease the little lowly. "Pig fat." Immediately Henrietta's cute face scrunched up as she backed away from her brother with an abhorrent expression. "Ew, she cried as she ran away from her precious big brother. As she ran away, Berengar laughed to the point where he nearly fell on his knees. The little girl's expression was just too cute. Suddenly he remembered her face had a smudge of dirt on it, and he hollered at his sister from across the hall. "Henrietta, take a bath. You've got dirt on your face." Thus Berengar had to wait a bit longer for his nightly bath. After all, he was fine with letting his darling little sister take a bath first. As he walked back to his room, he could not help but feel a watchful gaze set upon him. He was certain he was being spied upon but refused to reveal it as that would only cause more trouble. As such, Berengar walked back to his room in an inconspicuous manner, never alerting the spy that he was aware of the presence. After reaching the sanctuary of his room, Berengar let out a deep sigh of relief. He would have to be more cautious going forward. It would appear Lambert had set spies upon him to watch his actions. It would not be long before that little bastard attempted to assassinate him again. Berengar refused to die so quickly after being reincarnated. If Lambert wanted to unleash spies upon him, that was fine. Two could play that game. Slowly but surely, Berengar was winning the hearts of the common folk, and they were the greatest potential spy force in the world. After all, not a single noble would expect the peasantry to report their activities to someone else. Shortly after the event, Berengar took his nightly bath and once more tucked in Henrietta, who was now as clean as a whistle. After telling her a story about the heroes from the history of his previous life, he went back to his own bedroom, where he locked the door behind him and latched the windows. However, he decided to leave the curtains open, which allowed the light of the full moon to shine upon his sleeping body like a guardian angel watching over him. Chapter 10: A Verbal Thrashing. As the light of dawn shone upon Berengar's regal face, he awoke peacefully. Though his body was sore all over from his previous day's activities, he still managed to drag himself out of bed. If he kept pushing himself like this, his body might give out on him before he can cure himself of his natural infirmity. Thus he decided to take a day off from excessive exercise. Instead, he spent the early morning converting the jar of lard he received from Gunther into the pomade he had so dearly desired. Using a homemade recipe, which he utilized extensively in his previous life, Berengar had finally succeeded in his endeavor. His next course of action was taking his morning bath, which was a bit earlier than usual. Afterward, he placed his fingers into the wax-like substance and slicked his hair back with it. After carefully styling his hair, he gazed at himself in the bathroom mirror. Aside from his thin and frail body, he looked very majestic with the new hairstyle. His previous attempt using grease residue from the bath to style his hair ended disastrously. It smelled bad, it kept falling out of place, and it did not meet Berengar's excessive conditions in the slightest. However, after successfully inventing pomade, his already exquisite appearance improved further. He was amazed at how much better looking his current body was than in his previous life. The golden blonde hair, which now shimmered in the light of dawn, the deep sapphire eyes, which appeared as if they had been chiseled out of gemstone, and the milky white skin which every girl dreamed of having combined perfectly into a princely appearance suiting his noble heritage. The only advantage his previous appearance had over his current one was that it had a strong and fit body. However, these things could naturally be improved over time, and he was in no hurry to impress the women of this era. He had many things to accomplish before even thinking of getting married. Besides the only members of the opposite sex he was remotely close to were his little sister and his mother. At the very least, he would have to be introduced to a proper woman before he could even attempt to woo her. After styling his appearance and gazing at himself in the mirror, Berengar had taken the time to get dressed in an opulent black doublet, with gilded lining, as well as an equally luxurious set of hose, and a pair of black leather shoes. He sighed heavily as he looked at himself in the mirror one last time. His family truly wasted too much money on maintaining appearances. After donning his attire, he left the bath and instinctively headed to the dining room. He was quite early by the standards of his recent routine. As such, he caught his family off guard when he arrived at the dining room, where they were all seated, having a polite conversation as they waited for him to arrive. Upon entering the dining room, his family glanced over at him with shocked expressions. They were not expecting him to have such a refined appearance. Even Lambert gazed upon Berengar with envy. Sometimes it took a change in hairstyle to reveal the full potential of one's appearance. Henrietta blushed at her brother's striking demeanor and looked away. Even his mother, Gisella's mouth, hung agape, which she quickly covered with her hand. Sieghard looked upon his son and heir with a gaze of fatherly approval. Finally, the boy he had raised appreciated his taste of the finer things in life. However, he wondered how the little bugger had managed to style his hair in such an imposing manner. Seeing his family's odd expressions, Berengar touched his face with his right hand. "What is it? Do I have something on my face?" In unison, his family members shook their heads in silence, with various emotions in their awkward gazes. After confirming his appearance was tidy, Berengar sat down at the table across from Lambert and lifted his hands as he prepared for the morning grace. However, his family was too busy examining the change in appearance to notice his posture. After a few moments of silence, Berengar looked up at his father. "Father, do you not wish to say grace this morning?" Having the memories of Julian, Berengar was now a closet atheist. Nevertheless, he still put on the appearance of a devout Catholic because he knew the consequences a man of science would endure in this primitive era. It would take decades, but maybe he could usher in the scientific revolution a bit earlier than in his own timeline if he worked hard at it. After snapping out of their trance, his father began to speak his prayer as the family listened. Afterward, the family began to dig into their meal. While cutting apart his pork sausage with his utensils, Berengar overheard Lambert reporting his previous day's activities to their father. "Father, did you know that Berengar spent the whole day plowing the fields with a peasant yesterday?" Their father, who was just about to bite into his sausage, gazed over at Berengar with a confused look on his face. "You plowed a field?" Berengar would not resort to disparaging the friend he had made the previous day to save face among the nobility. As such, he had no shame in his voice as he admitted to his day's venture. "Yes, Father, I suppose that's why I took the day off from my morning exercise. Overexerting oneself will have negative effects on the body." This confused his father further. Why would he take time out of his exercise schedule to plow a field? He could not help but inquire about the details. Any reason in particular? Lambert sneered at Berengar as if he had caused a loss of favor for Berengar with their father. However, the words that came next astounded him. Well, you see, father, I had this brilliant idea about improving crop rotation. However, as you know, I am not a farmer, so I sought out a professional's opinion on my theory. The man turned out to know his craft quite well, and as we got to discuss the feasibility of it, we decided to try it out. And I am a man who leads by example, so I picked up a plow and got to work. Lambert scoffed at this response. How could Berengar develop a new innovation for agriculture all on his lonesome? Clearly, this was a facade his older brother was putting on to turn the situation to his advantage. As such, Lambert immediately questioned Berengar about his so-called innovation. He would catch his older brother in his lie and reveal to everyone that Berengar was a fraud. A wicked sneer curved upon Lambert's lips as he thought to himself. Older brother, you are still too naive to play these games with me. After which he voiced his concerns aloud. You say you invented an innovation of crop rotation, and what might that be? Berengar stared at Lambert coldly once again, which instinctively caused the teenage boy to shiver. After staring him down, Berengar scoffed at the impertinence of his little brother's statement. Even if I described it to you in vast detail, you would not be able to comprehend it. You do not have a mind for agriculture, little brother. Lambert was infuriated by this response. He had not expected his older brother to attack his weak point. It was true that Lambert did not know the first thing about agriculture, nor did he understand engineering. He had only ever heard the phrase crop rotation before. He hadn't the slightest clue how it functioned. That was not the responsibility of a noble scion like himself. Before he could respond to Berengar's allegations, Berengar had already seized the initiative and addressed their father with a tone of great respect. Father, if you wish to know the details, I won't hide anything from you, but I fear it might be a waste of our time together as a family, as I'm certain I would only bore the children with the intricate details of crop rotation. Lambert was furious at this point. Did Berengar seriously place him in the same category as Henrietta? As if he was some small child? He was only a few months away from his 16th birthday, which would make him a man in the eyes of God and men. Despite his internal protests, the boys still did not manage to get a word out, as their father, Sigurd, agreed with Berengar's terms. You're right, Berengar. There are more important matters to discuss as a family right now. For example, how did you manage to get your hair to look like that? Lambert, who at that moment had stuffed his mouth with a slice of sausage, nearly choked upon it after hearing his father's words. Berengar was also surprised at his father's words. The old baron truly did have a fascination with fashion. Though quickly, a light flashed in Berengar's eyes as he thought of this as an opportunity to coerce his father into engaging in proper hygiene. I'm afraid it won't work for you, father. Sigurd could practically feel his heart break as he heard such words. He could not explain why, but after gazing at his son's dignified appearance that was better suited to royalty, he needed to know how to make himself look so majestic. Of course, he unwittingly fell into Berengar's trap. Why not? A sound of panic had entered Sigurd's voice as he practically stood up from the head of the table after hearing such dire news. Berengar, on the other hand, had to prevent himself from smiling. Sometimes, it was too easy to manipulate his father into doing his bidding. Because you don't bathe frequently enough. After hearing Berengar's words, hope surged in the old baron's heart. If that were the only problem, then he would bathe just as much as his son if he had to. He didn't care if people made fun of him for doing so as long as he could have the glistening golden hair of his son. Realizing that his father had thoroughly grabbed onto the bait, Berengar decided to set the hook in and reel in the catch. The product I invented to style my hair this way only works on clean hair, though I promise you even if you work up a sweat, with this solution, your hair will stay intact like mine. Though, you do need to clean it off again at night. This was complete and utter bullshit, but if it meant he could improve the hygiene of another member of his family, so be it. A little white lie like this never hurt anyone. By the time the breakfast had been finished, his entire family, except for Lambert, were convinced of the values of proper hygiene. The Baron had begun to draft plans for the entire servant staff to wash their hands throughout the day regularly. Berengar left the dining room with a giant smile on his face. He was one step closer to introducing a sense of modern hygiene to his family's lands. Hopefully, this clean lifestyle would catch on soon enough. He could not help but fear an epidemic breaking out because people were uneducated about disease and filth. For the time being, this was sufficient. After all, the people he regularly contacted would be forced to practice some degree of basic hygiene. His next stop was to visit Gunther. As a member of the peasant class, the man was instrumental in Berengar's plans to implement the four-field system across all farms within the Barony of Kufstein. Chapter 11: An Unwanted Betrothal. Berengar was just about to step out of the castle when he heard his father's voice calling out for him. "Berengar, do you mind speaking with me in the study real quick?" Berengar let out a deep sigh. Apparently, his plans to visit Gunther and use his connections to implement the four-field system would have to wait. Steadily, Berengar strode into his father's study. As he sat down in the chair in front of his father's desk, he could see his father staring at him with a curious gaze. Berengar knew that look all too well. However, before he could protest, Sigurd let out a heavy sigh much like his own son had done not 2 minutes prior. "Berengar, my son, you're 20 years old and still unmarried. I understand your reasons, however, a healthy glow returns to your skin with each passing day. It appears that whatever you've been doing has been good for your well-being. Now that your childhood infirmity seems to be passing, it's time to think about finding a wife." Berengar repeatedly tapped the armrest on his chair while resting his face on his right fist, a habit which he had developed in his previous life whenever he was sitting down. During these moments, the only sound that could be heard was the clunk of the wooden armrest whenever a finger would strike upon it. Within Berengar's mind, he attempted to find a way to prolong this discussion. He was not ready to be married yet. After all, he had so much work that needed to be done, and courting a woman would take up much of his time that was currently needed elsewhere. However, he could not tell his father such things, seeing as how the young lord's ambitions were on the borderline of infringing upon his father's rights as baron. His father might have a penchant for fashion and luxury, but he was no fool. He could tell Berengar had lofty plans for the realm, but Berengar was still a young man. He would have plenty of time to enact such policies when he inherited the position of baron. For now, he should find himself a bride and have children, thus continuing the family line. Fundamentally, Berengar had a 21st century mindset for this kind of stuff. His plan was to get married in his 30s to a beautiful woman 10 years younger than himself after he had made a fortune by beginning the industrialization of his family's land. However, in his estimation, this would take many years to accomplish fully. One of his biggest concerns was that despite the vast resource-rich lands his family held, the population was sparse, uneducated, and mostly unskilled, seeing as how an overwhelming majority of them were working in the fields. For the time being, he could not take charge of the family's finances without his father's approval. As such, he could not implement policies that required substantial investment like public education, which would be vital in creating a new generation of skilled laborers in a variety of fields which was truly necessary for an industrial society to thrive. Despite being deep in thought, Berengar needed to answer his father. The man was growing impatient, especially since the only thing the old baron could hear for the last few moments was the tapping noise produced by Berengar's fingers repeatedly pouncing upon the wooden armrest of his chair. Just when Sigurd was about to scold Berengar, the young lord sighed as he sounded dejected at his father's request. "Who do you have in mind?" A small smile spread across Sigurd's lips as he gazed upon his son. The boy was finally growing up. "You remember your cousin Adela, right? My sister's third daughter and the daughter of the Count of Steiermark." Berengar was revolted at the thought of marrying his cousin. He had nearly forgotten that it was a fairly common practice in the medieval period for nobles to marry off their sons and daughters to their siblings' children. Nevertheless, he kept a straight face as he showed respect to his father's wishes. "Little Adela? I haven't seen her in ages. How old is she now? 13. Sigurd nodded at his son with a smile on his face. "She will be turning 13 this year. I hear she's blossoming into a stunning young woman." Berengar tried not to frown. He had expected an age gap, but this was far too young for him to feel comfortable courting. Though it may be slightly more normal in these times, his 21st century mindset made him feel like a groomer just thinking about it. Nevertheless, the more he thought about it, the more the idea appealed to him. Not because he was attracted to his 12-year-old cousin, but this gave him roughly 4 years to set his plans into motion before he was married. At most, they'd be engaged in name only, and he could probably find some way to weasel his way out of the betrothal before the girl turned 16 and he was forced to go through with the act. Berengar began to tap his chair once more as he thought about the monumental decision that would affect his entire life. After another few moments, he broke the silence between the two. I would have to meet her first and see what kind of young woman she has become. His father was pleased, though slightly disappointed. He did not fully manage to convince his son to accept the betrothal upon request, but Berengar didn't fully decline it either. Maybe there was some hope for the young man after all. After nodding his head in approval, Siegherd got up from his chair and walked Berengar to the door. I will send a letter to your uncle informing him of your request. You should expect a response within a fortnight. Berengar nodded. At the very least, this potential betrothal would buy him some time which he desperately needed. He probably would not appear before the girl for another 3 months. By that time, there should be some significant gains in his muscle mass, and his appearance would improve greatly. He would feel embarrassed trying to court a girl in his current borderline emaciated form. I'll leave it up to you, father. After getting that business out of the way, Berengar was finally able to leave the castle and meet up with Gunther to see how he and the land he worked was doing. Gunther had been hard at work, not only tending to the fields but spreading the idea of the 4-field system to the other farmers. It had only been a day, but he successfully managed to convince 3 of his friends to implement such a system on the fields they tended to. It would appear Berengar did not have much to do in regards to spreading the system. Gunther was well connected with many of the peasant farmers within the Barony of Kufstein. All Berengar had to do was sit back and let his competent underlings spread the industrial and agricultural innovations that he had already set in motion. For the remaining month, he would spend his time and energy increasing his fitness and building relations with the locals. For the remainder of the evening, he would return to the castle, take a bath, and get a good night's rest. That was the plan, of course, but just like the day prior, the moment he entered the castle's gates, Henrietta ran up and hugged him, inquiring about his whereabouts. "Big brother, where did you run off to this time?" A worried expression settled onto the little Loli's face. Berengar could not help but smile at her cuteness and patted her head. "I was just visiting the town and getting to know the locals. It's a lord's job to understand the conditions of his people." The little girl smiled as she felt her head patted and eventually let go of her hold over her brother. "You're finally in time for dinner. Let's go eat," she said as he pranced off in the direction of the dining room. Berengar followed after her. As he did so, he noticed the same strange presence he felt the night before. Lambert's spies were getting sloppier. Just like the prior night, Berengar ignored it and continued to the dining room. Still, he kept a keen eye on the area he suspected the spy to be hiding. He did not want to receive a bolt in the back while he was not paying attention. After reaching the dining room with his little sister, Berengar noticed his family already seated. They had not expected him to come home so soon after all his daily routine as of the last few days kept him busy during this hour. Nevertheless, he had arrived on time for once. His mother and father were pleased to see him, but Lambert was clearly not. After sitting at the seat across from Lambert, Berengar gazed at him briefly with an indifferent expression before returning his gaze to the plate in front of him. When he suddenly heard his mother's loving voice call out to him. "So, my son, I hear you are finally betrothed?" Berengar nearly choked on his food when he heard those words. He looked up to his mother with a shocked expression on his face. It had been merely a few hours since he discussed this with his father, and he had not fully accepted the betrothal. How did it suddenly turn into a done deal? Was this a set-up from his father all along? Had the old man already negotiated the betrothal by the time they had the discussion? Henrietta dropped her fork when she heard those words and looked at Berengar with shock. Her big brother was getting married? She had never even thought of it as possible since he was so much older and still single. Though she was very intimate with her big brother, she by no means had any unhealthy ideas towards him. If anything, she was happy that there was finally someone he could spend the rest of his life with. After the shock vanished, she smiled at Berengar and immediately asked him all kinds of questions. "Who is it? Is she pretty? Do I know her?" Henrietta sent a barrage of questions towards Berengar while still trying to comprehend what had transpired behind the scenes. Lambert was equally stunned. He did not believe a single nobleman within the region was remotely interested in setting up an engagement with Berengar. Hell, he had gone through great lengths to prevent it. Justu was acting without his knowledge, or the knowledge of the Count of Tyrol for that matter. The boy could not believe somebody within the county of Tyrol would risk angering the Count. After all, the two had been plotting together against Berengar for some time. He never expected a Count of another region to personally arrange a betrothal with the wastrel that was his older brother. Berengar, finally snapping out of his shock, glared at his father menacingly, his fists curling up as he struggled to contain the urge to strike the old baron for plotting against him. Nevertheless, he was in no position to do so and calmed himself down, gritting his teeth as he chastised his father for his actions. "Father, what did you do?" Sigurd stared down his errant son. For too long, he had enabled this boy's idle behavior. The fact that he showed interest in the proposed marriage was good enough reason for him to accept it. He knew in his heart that sooner or later, the boy would accept the proposal, so why would he bother wasting time with an introduction between the two cousins? "You seemed interested, so I expedited the process by accepting the Count's terms." Berengar was furious, so there really had been terms already laid out, and his father gauged Berengar's level of interest on whether or not he should accept. Berengar was interested, but not for the reasons his father believed. He wanted to meet the girl to know for sure whether or not his plans could succeed. It was too late now, he was already betrothed, and there was nothing he could do about it. No longer in the mood to eat, Berengar ripped the napkin off his doublet and tossed it aside as he stormed out of the dining hall. He was no longer in the mood to dine with his family. After finishing his bath, he returned to his room, where he fell asleep. He would no longer dwell on things that were out of his control, for now, he had to focus his efforts on getting stronger. It would only take a month or so before his innovations were fully adopted and in place within the Barony of Kufstein. On the other side of the castle, an oil lamp was lit on the desk in the room of Lambert. He was quickly writing a letter to the Count of Tyrol, his future father-in-law, requesting his help in scheming against his brother once more. If his brother should marry and have a son before Lambert could get rid of him, it would be disastrous for their plans. Only after the oil had fully burned from his lamp did Lambert put down his quill. Attaching the letter to a carrier pigeon, he sent his wicked schemes into the night sky and towards the Count's residence at Innsbruck. Chapter 12 Production complete. As the month passed by, Berengar found himself spending most of his days exercising, eating healthy, and acquainting himself with his subjects. By now, the common folk of Kufstein was mostly aware of his humble and just nature. He had found himself spending some of his free time helping villagers with personal requests. Every day for lunch, he would dine among the common folk at the local bakery. Under his guiding hand, the local baker and butcher teamed up to create a local sandwich shop booming in business. Berengar had to admit, inventing the sandwich was one of his best ideas. It was a cheap and healthy option for the villagers to cobble together and eat when they had the chance. The longer time went on, the more he added to the culinary culture of Kufstein. Instructing chefs on making schnitzel, spätzle, and other common German foods that were iconic in his previous life but had yet to be invented. It was not simply a matter of advancing technology, he would have to bring a new era of culture with him if he wanted to accomplish his goals for the land over which his family governed. During this period of time, Berengar had earned the trust of the servants in the castle and the village folk and had even set up a small spy network within his family's lands. It was used entirely to counter Lambert's attempts to end his life and usurp his birthright, and as such certain commoners became aware of the Baron's second son's true nature. In public, Lambert seemed like a noble and pious man, but the reality was very different. Lambert was completely unaware that his every move had been watched by the common folk he looked down upon and reported to his older brother. He may have the local nobility on his side, but there was only so much they could do when the people protected Berengar. Who would poison his food? If the chefs who admired Berengar's passion for the culinary arts were the ones who would directly bring the food to the table in an attempt to hear Berengar's criticisms so that they may learn from him. In his past life, Berengar had lived alone for many years and cooked for himself. Over time he had become quite the adequate chef. Though these men who cooked his meals had far more talent than he ever had, they lacked the knowledge of recipes and spices that Berengar brought with him from the memories of his past life. Every so often Berengar would check up on the progress in which Gunther and Ludwig had made, and he was pleased with the results. The progress on the beehive ovens, blast furnace, and Bessemer converter was going smoothly. By the end of the month, they would be complete. The same could be said about the 4-field system, With Gunther's backing and Berengar's improving reputation, the barony would have a 4-field harvest this year. While the month came to a close, the young lord had found himself healthier by the day. No longer was he haunted by the gaunt lines of malnutrition that ravaged his otherwise excellent appearance. The shallow cheeks of his face had filled in nicely and had enhanced his already majestic features. The improvement to his condition was tremendous. It was amazing what a high-protein and calcium diet could do for the body. Though he was by no means a bodybuilder and had still maintained a very lean appearance, Berengar was certainly no longer sickly in the slightest. His torso no longer had the haggard appearance of a feeble old man but shined with the vigor of youth. There were even signs of definition in the muscle on his body, and a six-pack steadily began to form. His milky white skin maintained its grace, but the unhealthy pale effect had been replaced with a healthy glow. Despite these gains, he was still far from the fitness goals that he wished to accomplish, yet Berengar was satisfied with his appearance for now. He had finally overcome a lifetime of pestilence and frailty. Perhaps now he could even swing a sword properly, though, with his plans in mind for military innovations, the age of swords and arrows would soon be coming to an end. After finishing his morning bath time, Berengar entered the dining room to eat his morning meal with his beloved family. However, Lambert was noticeably missing from the occasion. He had ventured to Innsbruck to visit his fiancée. This allowed Berengar a slight reprieve from the constant battles of intrigue he had secretly been engaging in with his little brother behind the scenes. He was aware that Lambert was cooking up an assassination attempt in the shadows, and the likelihood of his visit to Innsbruck involving that purpose was high. If the Count of Tyrol was backing Lambert's plot to eliminate him, it did not bode well. Thus Berengar had no choice. He would have to meet with his fiancée and gain the backing of her father, the Count of Steiermark. It was a task he had been putting off for some time now, primarily out of concern for his appearance. He had not seen Adela since she was a little girl. As such, this meeting would be the first time she had seen his adult appearance, and he had been waiting for satisfactory results. First impressions were key, especially when he really needed to convince the girl's father that he was not a sickly young man, of mild intellect and idle nature as the rumors had stated. He needed to prove he was healthy, determined, and cunning. If he were to be backed by a noble of equal stature, then the Count of Tyrol would have to think twice about assassinating Berengar. As long as Berengar could contain Lambert's schemes to those dwelling within the Barony of Kufstein, he was positive he could foil any attempt on his life and inheritance. Eventually, though, he would need a more permanent solution to Lambert and his many schemes. Berengar could not very well have someone who intends to kill him live within his domain. The conversation at the breakfast table was delightful now that he did not have to worry about Lambert trying to affect his family's opinion of him. His father was very proud of the results of his training, and his mother could not help but smile every time she saw how healthy her baby boy had become. Henrietta, on the other hand, was happily enjoying her food without a care in the world. Berengar was snacking on a breakfast sandwich made of toasted sourdough bread, sausage, egg, ham, bacon, and cheese. It was one of his favorite breakfasts in his previous life, and it was just as great in this one. His parents did not know where the idea of sandwiches came from, but they also enjoyed the new culinary inventions over the past month. After finishing the sandwich and washing it down with a mug of milk, Berengar discussed his concerns with his father. "Father, I do believe it's time for me to meet with Adela. We've been officially betrothed for nearly a month now, and I have yet to see her face." Sigurd smiled. He knew his son would be asking about it soon enough. The reason he hadn't asserted they meet sooner is that he too shared Berengar's concerns over the boy's prior appearance, but that was no longer a factor. Truth be told, he had received several letters requesting his son's appearance, which he had been stalling for time with his replies. However, he could not ignore the last one. Apparently, the little girl got fed up waiting on Berengar to accept her requests for a meeting and had already set out for Kufstein to force an encounter with her betrothed. He had not informed his son of this yet, and he figured now was the perfect time to do so. "About that, it would appear your little cousin was too eager to meet you, and she has already set out for Kufstein. She should be arriving tomorrow morning." Berengar smiled. He truly had not expected this, but he liked the little girl's determination. Maybe they could get along after all. However, he was not too sure what he could have in common with a 12-year-old girl. Nevertheless, he was pleased to hear the news. He would not have to wait a fortnight to meet the girl. nor would he have to travel all the way to Graz, which was the capital of Steiermark and the home to its count. Good, that fits with my plans for the upcoming days. Sigurd relaxed his shoulders and sighed after hearing Berengar's response. He thought the boy would be displeased with the news. After all, he had reacted so strongly to being engaged that he feared the boy would do something stupid in an attempt to break it off. Nevertheless, his son appeared to have accepted the betrothal. Sigurd had no idea that the only reason Berengar accepted the idea was that he needed to borrow the Count of Steiermark's power to interfere with Lambert's deadly schemes. Berengar still was not pleased with the betrothal, but necessity forced his hand. If he had to court a young girl to ensure his survival, he would do so. Luckily, the two wouldn't be married until the girl was 16, an acceptable age to Berengar. Neither of the two men knew that the girl was ahead of schedule and was already at the border of the barony. It would not be long before the couple would meet for the first time in many years. Nevertheless, because they had no way of knowing, Berengar went on with his plans for the day. Ludwig should have completed the project by now, and as such, after finishing his meal and being excused, Berengar went to the town and visited the area where Ludwig had constructed the devices. Gazing up at a series of beehive ovens which were already aflame cooking the coal mined from the mountains into coke, a wide grin spread across Berengar's face. As Berengar stood in awe at the small industrial sector that had rapidly sprung up over the past month, Ludwig snuck up behind the young lord and patted him on the shoulder. "My lord, as you can see, we have completed your designs and have already begun the process of creating the first batch of steel." Berengar looked across the small industrial sector built beside the river and saw that the blast furnace, which was powered by a water wheel, was already in the production of pig iron. The beehive ovens produced the coke, which was then used to fuel the blast furnace to create molten pig iron, which was sent into the Bessemer converter to create steel. Everything was flowing like a well-oiled machine. It would not be long until they had produced their first batch of steel, which they could sell to Innsbruck for a small fortune. Once he gained the profits, he would invest them into the mining sector of the small barony and truly begin large-scale production of steel. Berengar smiled as he slapped Ludwig on the back in a friendly gesture. "Ludwig, my friend, you have really outdone yourself." The two men smiled at each other as they stared in silence watching the operation of the semi-modern industrial sector in which they had created together. Though they had no way of knowing it, on this day in the year of our Lord 1417, the 2nd of April marks the day when Berengar would become known by his enemies as the Tyrant of Steel. Chapter 13. The Count's daughter arrives. Adela stared outside the windows of her luxurious carriage, guarded by a retinue of knights belonging to her father. Her golden blonde hair, which was tied into twintails, glistened under the sunlight which shone upon her face, enhancing the natural beauty of her dazzling sapphire eyes. Despite being 12 years old, she was nicely filling out the long baby blue dress which she wore. Her perfect hourglass figure would only improve further with age. A drop of sweat began to pour down from her milky white shoulders as she fanned herself off with her exquisite hand fan. She had traversed a large distance to enter this lowly barony. Adela von Gratz was the third daughter of Count Otto von Gratz, who was the Count of Steiermark. Against her wishes, she had been betrothed to her sickly elder cousin, which during the last time they met he appeared to be on his last limb. Somehow Berengar had managed to limp onwards in life until his 20th year. She had no idea how such a frail and unhealthy youth had endured life this long. However, because of this, she was furious with her father, who had used her as a way to get a stake in Kufstein's rich iron mines. As a girl, she was nothing more than a tool for her family to secure alliances, and she was not content with this lot in life. Nevertheless, she had to obey her family's wishes, and as such demanded to meet the man she would eventually be married to. However, to her dismay, her requests to meet with him kept being delayed. For an entire month, she had to endure this behavior until the point where she left her home and traveled across the entire Duchy of Austria to meet with him. From her perspective, the behavior of Berengar and his family was unsightly. Clearly, something was wrong with his health, otherwise, why would his family keep delaying his visit? If he was seriously too sick to travel, then she would convince her father to break the betrothal. It was no wonder that Berengar was 20 years old and still unmarried. When she entered the village of Kufstein, she took notice of the smoke rising in the air, and initially thought a fire had broken out. Yet, to her surprise, the peasants rushed towards the smoky area in flocks as if something extraordinary had transpired. Curious as to what could gain the interests of so many of the common folk, the young lady ordered the driver of her carriage to approach the area to see what the commotion was about. After stepping out of the carriage and entering the industrial sector which had recently been built, her eyes were not attracted to the strange machinery which was producing the smoke but to that of a tall and handsome young man with slicked-back golden blonde hair, and sapphire eyes which matched her own perfectly. Despite the luxurious clothing he was wearing, the man stood next to an ordinary peasant, both of which had large smiles on their faces. The young lady had not paid the slightest amount of attention to the peasant next to the handsome young man who she immediately recognized despite the many years since their last meeting. She spoke her disbelief aloud as her cheeks flushed at the sight of her elder cousin who had grown extremely handsome since she last laid eyes upon him. Berengar? Despite voicing her thoughts, she remained unheard by the Baron's son who was otherwise engaged with the actions of the machinery before him. It did not take long for the Bessemer converted to dump its load of molten steel into the small factory, where it was further processed into ingots. The slag, which was produced as a byproduct, was taken away and converted into a phosphate fertilizer under the instructions of Berengar. Adela was stuck in a trance and had not heard a word that escaped Berengar's lips. Her body moved on its own as it inched ever closer to Berengar's presence, who was still blissfully unaware of the contingent of knights clearing the way for the Count's daughter. Ludwig, you did not disappoint. With this batch of steel, we can use the profits to get the mines working at full capacity. We should be able to produce an overabundance of steel within a year. However, before Ludwig could respond to Berengar's compliments, the young lord's attention shifted to the girl approaching him and the knights who protected her. He could not explain why, but he felt like he knew this beautiful young girl from somewhere. He immediately noticed the flushed cheeks and entranced gaze she was giving him as she bashfully looked away from Berengar, and into the direction of the ground. She asked him the question that was on her mind. Berengar, is that you? Apparently, he did know this young girl, but he could not place a finger on who it was. He felt it would be improper to ask, but he truly had no choice as he could not fully remember the girl's identity no matter how much he tried. You are? Adela instantly felt like her heart had grown 3 sizes upon seeing Berengar and then plummeted into an abyss when he failed to recognize her. This bastard had grown so handsome, and yet he did not manage to recognize her beautiful face? What was wrong with his thick head? Despite her inner fury, Adela put a smile upon her face and a graceful act as she bowed before Berengar. It is me, Adela, your fiancé. Berengar was taken aback. He was not expecting her visit today. He thought for sure his father had told him she would arrive tomorrow. Damn it all, did that sly old fox seriously set him up again? He was once more furious at his father. Nevertheless, there was nothing he could do about it now. Standing in front of him was his fiancée, who, if he was being honest, had developed wonderfully. In a few years she would definitely be a knockout. Nevertheless, despite her potential beauty, he had no real attraction to her. After all, she was still a young girl, and not yet a woman. However, he smiled after knowing that his fiancée would grow into a stunning woman. After calming himself down, and adjusting to the situation, Berengar put on the facade of a proper nobleman. Truthfully, Berengar had virtually no experience in charming the opposite sex, so he had to rely on his one source of infallible knowledge that explained how to win a young girl's favor. That source obviously being the many shoujo manga he had read in his previous life. Without any shame, he adopted the mannerisms of a character from some random manga in his memories, which just so happened to be a prince. Apologies, my lady, I did not recognize you. The last time I saw you, you were but a child. Now you have become an astonishing young woman. He cringed internally at his acting, but if there was one thing shoujo manga had taught him, it is that if you wanted to win the favor of a young girl, you had to be handsome and charming, and this was the only way he knew how to act charming. If Berengar wanted this engagement to work, he at least had to make the girl feel like he was interested. It worked like a charm. Adela was fully enamored in Berengar's handsome appearance and charming act. She had completely forgotten the fury she felt not long ago when Berengar failed to recognize her. Ludwig, watching the cheap romantic display, struggled to contain his laughter while observing the boy's performance. Luckily for Berengar, this girl was but a child and could easily fall for such falsities. Though the longer he stood there watching, the more he recognized that he was no longer needed and tapped Berengar on the shoulder. You don't need to worry, my lord. I can handle the rest of the production myself. Why don't you take your girl out for a sandwich? Berengar gazed at Ludwig with brotherly affection. Both men knew that Berengar was more interested in staying and overseeing the production of the steel and slag, but he was limited by his noble obligations. Thus Ludwig gave him a reasonable excuse to leave him behind. If you insist, I will leave the matter to you. I thank you for your hard work. Adela gazed at Berengar with further interest. Despite being a baron's son, he treated the peasants almost as if they were equals. She had never heard of such a thing before. Though most nobles would mock him for such behavior, she found the friendly exchange between the two acquaintances to be quite endearing. Berengar offered his arm for the young lady to grab onto, which she accepted as the couple walked towards the center of the town with smiles on their faces. During the walk to the sandwich shop, Berengar spent the time to say hello to the locals who had passed by. He appeared to be on a first-name basis with many of the commoners, and they, of course, referred to him with the proper respect for his position. Adela became increasingly curious about Berengar's relationship with the commoners. They did not fear him, nor were they intimidated by his position. Instead, they willingly walked up and chatted with him, and by extension her. She was not used to such a sociable walk. In her father's domain, the peasants stayed out of the count and his family's way, never making eye contact with them. It was as if she had stepped into a totally different culture. One woman had even approached the couple and handed Berengar a rose to give to the young lady next to him. All of the commoners could tell by the way Adela was dressed that she was obviously nobility. Due to the way she was clinging to Berengar, they were most likely engaged. Because of this, the common folk treated her with the same dignity and heartfelt respect they gave to Berengar, who had spent so much time helping develop the town over the last month. By the time they reached the sandwich shop, Berengar had approached a woman in her 30s who was at the counter running the store in her husband's absence. Her name was Helga, and she was the local baker's wife. She helped her husband run the bakery and the sandwich shop, which was co-owned by the local baker and butcher. She saw Berengar walk through the store entrance with a pretty young girl in hand and smiled at the couple. "My lord, you honor us with your presence." Berengar smiled in return and ordered a meal for himself and Adela. "Helga, 2 of the usual, please." Helga immediately got to work as she began to prepare the food, but not before washing her hands. By now, the entire village was aware of Berengar's health habits and had begun to adopt his clean ways. After serving up 2 sandwiches, each paired with a glass of fresh milk, Berengar paid the woman with a white pfennig which was worth more than the entire meal. "Keep the change," he said as he smiled and took the food and glasses over to a table outside the restaurant. Seeing as how it was the middle of spring in the mountains of Austria, the weather was more than acceptable to sit outside and dine. Adela had not said a word the entire time they were walking. She observed Berengar's behavior, which was far from what she expected from the notoriously idle and petty sickly lord. He was nothing like the rumors had said. Clearly, someone was making up lies about him to ruin his reputation. She would never believe that his personality had changed overnight due to a near-death experience. Being a noble lady of high repute, she was confused about the absence of silverware when dining. How exactly was she going to eat this concoction referred to as a sandwich by the locals? Berengar smiled at her as she intensely stared at the food. The charming smile nearly sent her into another daze. "What's wrong? You don't like it? You haven't even tried it yet." The young lady struggled to find her words as she stared at Berengar's exquisite smiling face. Eventually, she managed to find her tongue. "There's no silverware." Berengar chuckled as he had forgotten about the aversion the nobles had towards the way commoners behaved. Thus he decided to lead by example as he grabbed a hold of the roast chicken sandwich with his hands and bit into it. The look on Adela's face was priceless. It was as if she was looking at a barbarian. There was no way she would stoop to such uncouth behavior. However, after a few moments of watching Berengar eat the sandwich with a satisfied smile on his face, she could no longer resist the temptation to try the food. As such, she held onto the sandwich with her petite hands and took a small nibble out of it, which nearly caused Berengar to choke on his food from laughter. This girl was too cute. In a way, she reminded him of a slightly older Henrietta. The sparkle in Adela's glistening sapphire eyes lit up as she tasted the sandwich. She had never had something like this before. Truth be told, the culinary arts of the medieval age were severely lacking. He had spent great effort teaching the chefs in his castle, as well as the locals, how to make basic dishes from his previous life. After a while, she noticed Berengar watching her and felt embarrassed. However, she couldn't stop eating the sandwich. Only after she finished the entire thing did she question his gaze. "What are you staring at?" Berengar chuckled slightly. "Women, no matter what time they're in, are still the same. I just thought that you were cute, is all." Instantly the girl's entire face turned red as his voice was played back in her head repeatedly. She had not expected him to say such a thing. Her brain had practically fried itself thinking about it. Did he have no shame? Though it's not as if she didn't like the compliment. Only after the two of them had finished their meal did Berengar bring up the noble obligations that had to be paid. "Well, I suppose we should go visit my father so that you can pay your respects. Lord knows he will be outraged by the fact that you entered his territory and failed to pay him respects upon entry." This snapped the girl out of her trance as she quickly realized she had failed to follow basic noble etiquette. She nearly slapped herself for following her curiosity rather than sticking to the schedule. By the way, Berengar spun it. She might have insulted the Baron's authority by doing so. The little girl had no way of knowing that Berengar was playing a prank on her. Sure, if it were any other noble who entered his father's dominion and failed to pay respects, the Baron would be furious, but this was his niece and also his son's fiancée. He would easily forgive her for playing around with Berengar upon arrival, especially since that was what her visit concerned in the first place. Sigurd would be happy just knowing the two were getting along. Nevertheless, the girl began to tremble with fear as she realized the grave sin she had committed. She did not know her uncle well, her mother rarely talked about him. She feared there would be a reprisal for her actions. Seeing the terrified expression on the little girl's face, Berengar grabbed hold of her hand and calmed her down. "Hey, there's no need to be so afraid, I was only joking. My father won't be mad at you for spending the day with me. Trust me. Even if he is angry, I will take the blame. Considering I was the one who dragged you to lunch." The little girl wiped away the tears that had been forming in her gentle sapphire eyes and sniffled slightly. Really? Berengar nodded. Maybe he shouldn't play jokes like this on children. After all, noble obligations and etiquette were likely a scary thing for a young girl such as her. If she messed up, it could not just affect her well-being but that of her family. After wiping the tears from her eyes, Adela got up from her seat and asked Berengar. "Well, what are we waiting for?" Afterward, the betrothed couple headed towards the castle, her retinue of knights closely following from a distance. They knew if they had followed their young lady so closely on her first date, she would be furious. As such, they stayed behind, keeping an eye on her safety from a close enough distance that if trouble showed itself, they could fulfill their duty. Of course, that would never happen in a town that celebrated Berengar as a pillar of the community and not just the Baron's son. Chapter 14. A fine evening. Berengar entered the castle's grand hall while holding Adela's hand. Her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment the entire time as she hid slightly behind Berengar's back, gazing up at him from behind. She had not expected the day to play out like this. Nevertheless, she was glad it did. She would be beside herself if Berengar had truly been as the rumors painted him. Sitting upon the seat of power of the realm was Baron Sigurd von Kufstein, who had a stern expression on his face. He was not expecting his niece's visit until tomorrow, yet here she was standing before him. These complicated things, he would undoubtedly need to throw a feast this evening to welcome a young lady of her position into his lowly territory. Sigurd was no fool, and he knew why his brother-in-law, the Count of Steiermark, had offered this proposal. Despite the Count's hidden intentions, looking down upon Adela, and how she behaved, he could already tell that this was a good match. When the Baron's cold gaze landed upon Adela, she shivered slightly, which did not go unnoticed. However, with a supporting gesture from Berengar, she fulfilled her noble obligations as she bowed before her uncle, greeting him with respect. After all, it has been quite some time since she last saw the man. Lady Adela von Gratz expresses her gratitude for providing hospitality during her visit. Berengar bowed before his father as well. Despite being the old man's son, he still had to show respect for his father's position. Sitting next to Sigurd was his wife Gisela, who had a much more warm expression on her face than her husband's. She thoroughly examined her daughter-in-law-to-be. Though she felt as if Adela was a bit young, the mature Baroness still nodded with approval. The girl was truly a young woman befitting her beloved son. Deep down, She felt bad for Lambert, whose fiancée was an entitled and sadistic brat who gained pleasure from humiliating the young boy. Such behavior had evolved from the brat's unearned sense of superiority. It would undoubtedly be a rough marriage for Gisella's second son. However, the feeling she gained from Adela's behavior gave the doting mother much confidence in her firstborn's future happiness. Truth be told, Berengar would much rather be out working on his plans for the future of industry and agriculture. However, building ties to the nobility was of dire importance to his current diplomatic strategy. He may be safe while in his own territory due to the protection provided by the people. Yet, if he were to travel beyond the borders of Kufstein, he may find himself plotted against by his brother's allies. Getting on good terms to his betrothed, whose father was a mighty count, provided him with a level of security necessary to deter those of a similar position. Sigurd carefully observed the relationship between his son and niece. Apparently, the two had spent some time together this afternoon. Though it spat in the face of common etiquette, he could forgive the young girl for getting tied up with Berengar. Recently his son had an aura of charisma that he severely lacked before. The boy seemed to be far more sociable than in the past. Truly Sigurd did not know what inspired the recent changes in his son's behavior, but he was grateful for whatever caused it. Now, if only Berengar could get along with the local nobility as he did with the commoners. Despite the girl's lack of manners, the old baron would still address the matter as he wanted to gauge the girl's character. After clearing his throat, Sigurd narrowed his eyes at the young girl. While standing up from his seat of power, he began to speak in a stern voice. "It seems you and my son are already acquainted. Tell me, is this why you did not immediately come and pay respects to me, the sovereign of this land?" Adela immediately flinched upon hearing her uncle's words and looked over at Berengar for help. The minute she did so, Sigurd pounded his fist on the armrest of the chair while his voice raised to a new height. Don't look away from me while I'm talking to you. Answer the question." Tears began to form in the young girl's eyes which she quickly wiped away, sniffling while she responded to the baron's request. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Seeing the expression on the poor girl's face, Berengar could no longer put up with his father's test. He grabbed a hold of Adela and dragged her into his arms while chastising his father. "Father, don't you think that tone of yours is a bit rude? After all, if anyone is to blame, it is me. I was the one who took her out to lunch before meeting you." The young girl looked up at Berengar with a sense of warmth in her sapphire eyes. The tears were still streaming down her doll-like face. She was slightly surprised that Berengar had stuck to his word and protected her from his father's wrath. Until now, there had been a slight hint of suspicion in her heart that he was putting on a facade and that deep down, he really was an idle wastrel like the rumors had said, even if he had become healthy. In the end, Berengar really was as he presented himself. This was true for the most part. Despite putting on a charming act based on a generic shoujo character, he more or less spoke from the heart, and his actions around the town had been completely genuine. Upon seeing his son stand up for the girl he was betrothed to, Sigurd's stern expression turned into a warm smile as he attempted to placate the girl and his son. "I'm sorry, Adela, I was quite rude. I only wanted to gauge your character. I hope you can forgive me." The young girl wiped the tears from her eyes which had finally begun to dry, and swallowed her excess saliva. She had slowly begun to understand why the Baron had tested her that way. Clearly, the loving parents wanted to know if Adela would deflect the responsibility onto their son or not. Even though Berengar took the blame himself, if she had thrust the responsibility on his shoulders before he could do so, it would have been an enormous act of disrespect to Berengar and his father. Evidently, Sigurd and his wife were very protective of their eldest son. After regaining her dignified appearance, the young lady accepted her uncle's apology with grace. "There's nothing to apologize for, dear uncle. You were merely protecting your son and heir." After she said that, the smiles on Sigurd and Gisella's faces improved. Further, this young lady was much better wife material than the bitch they had sold their second son to. In a few months Lambert would be married, and his fate would be sealed. However, there was nothing they could do about it. Refusing their liege because they disapproved of his daughter was an unwise play. If the relationship between those two could improve relations between their two houses, then so be it. For whatever reason, Lambert did not seem to mind the abuse he suffered at the hands of his fiancée. Siegherd stood up from his seat and approached Adela, and greeted her with open arms. "Welcome to my humble house. I hope you find your stay to be acceptable." Knowing that the girl was from a wealthy family, the lowly baron could not possibly believe that she would be being pleased with the humble lodgings of his domain. He had no way of knowing that the young girl had already fallen in love with the quaint old town where the locals were so friendly, and the culinary culture was unique. Adela was a big fan of the sandwich she had tasted earlier. By the time she dined at the feast in the evening, she would never want to leave the humble baron's domain. For now, though, the family engaged in small talk, getting caught up on the past few years. Adela was especially interested in how Berengar transitioned from a feeble, idle, and petty young lord to the man he was today. When she found out that the miraculous transformation only began a month ago, she could not believe her ears. Did the man before her seriously spring up after a near-death experience? If Berengar had not confirmed it himself, she would have never believed her aunt and uncle. Eventually, the table was set, and the feast had begun. Adela sat next to Berengar, who sat in his usual place at the table. The only family member who was missing was Lambert, which did not go unnoticed by Adela. When she heard he was visiting his fiancée, she was shocked by the coincidence. She never expected both of the von Kufstein sons to be out with their fiancées simultaneously. Nevertheless, her thoughts towards the missing son disappeared when she smelled the aroma of the food set upon the table by servants. Adela had never seen such extravagant cuisine before. Berengar had instructed the chefs to go all out on their new recipes. Schnitzel, Spätzle, Wurst, Rolladen, Sauerbraten, all the staples of German cuisine from Berengar's previous world, were presented on the table. All except one, the one in which Berengar desired as a side dish to his Jaeger Schnitzel most of all, potato pancakes. Curse his fate for being thrust into this world a century too early for the discovery of potatoes. That is what Berengar initially thought to himself as he lamented their absence from his favorite dishes. Still, he was glad to be alive. He swore to himself that when he became wealthy, he would hire an exploratory fleet to discover the new world and bring him back potatoes. Screw the Aztecs and their massive gold reserves, he needed potatoes. While his family had become accustomed to eating such treasures over the past month, Adela's eyes were lit with ecstasy as she tasted the gourmet cuisine for the first time in her life. No matter what, when she finally returned home, she had to bring these recipes back with her for her father's cooking staff. Though she was ecstatic about the delightful food, she still ate with the grace and civility expected of a young lady in her position. After delighting upon the food for the evening, the family finally went their separate ways. Henrietta was tasked with taking Adela to her room. The young girl also insisted on her future sister-in-law taking a bath before she went to bed. At first, the young lady refused as she did not see a reason, but the persistence of a girl younger than herself was not something she could escape. After bathing together in awkward silence, Adela finally got to her room where she could rest. As she lay down on her stomach and hugged her pillow in a baby blue nightgown, she could not help but think about Berengar's actions throughout the day. The girl fell to sleep shortly after with a loving smile on her face. Berengar, on the other hand, was burning the midnight oil, hard at work in his room drafting up plans for the expansion of the mines. There was also another matter in which he wanted to address as quickly as possible, the textile industry. Unlike Adela, he was not thinking about the day he had. Instead, the young man thought about his plans for the family's territory. Eventually, after drafting up several documents and blueprints, Berengar snuffed out the oil lamp, which provided illumination, and fell to sleep. The only thoughts on his mind were about the wonderful meal he had during the evening and the complete and total lack of potato pancakes. The young lord had no way of knowing that Adela had already fallen head over heels for him. Chapter 15 Unimaginable Wealth. When the light of dawn rose upon the fertile valley, once more Berengar had awoken to begin his daily exercise. Just because he was now a healthy young man did not mean he did not have to maintain said health. He began his routine with a series of push-ups, sit-ups, squats, and pull-ups. The exercise equipment he had specially ordered had arrived long ago and was kept firmly in the corner of his large stone room. As such, he could accomplish most of his objectives without leaving the comfort and safety of his own personal space. Nowadays, only his daily run was outside the confines of his bedroom. It was a truly efficient use of time and space. Once Berengar had finished his daily exercise, the first course of action he took was that of his morning bath. The young lord refused to spend the day covered in his own sweat. Though by now, everyone in the castle was aware of his bathing habits. It could practically be said that during the 30 minutes before breakfast, the bathroom was reserved for Berengar. The young lord was especially excited about today's bath. For you see, almost a month ago, after Berengar had convinced the family to begin bathing regularly, he realized the need for a more refined bathing area. As such, he successfully managed to convince his father to break ground on a grand project. During this past month, constant construction had been going on in the corner of the castle, where a private bathhouse was constructed within the castle walls. Today was the first day after its completion. As Berengar entered the new bathroom, he noticed there were 3 separate chambers for the large room. The first area was the dressing room, where the occupant would dress and undress. The second room was the lavatory, in case one needed to use it during bath time. The third area was the actual room where the bathing occurred. A large circular stone bath was fitted in the center of the room and was heated to nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This was not just a bath, it was practically a hot tub. Berengar spent a good 15 minutes soaking his stress away in the large bath in which he could practically swim before finally getting out. Afterward, he dried himself off with a towel and went to the dressing room, where he properly dressed. It was only after he was fully clothed that he decided to style his hair the way he preferred it. After confirming his appearance in the mirror, he left the newly designed bathhouse and headed for the dining room, where he met his family and fiancée for breakfast. As he snacked on his favorite breakfast sandwich, he looked over at Adela, who had another ecstatic smile on her face. It would appear that she had fallen in love with the food in this small barony. When she noticed Berengar's gaze, she covered her mouth with her napkin as her cheeks flushed. Though before she could speak, Berengar had shifted his attention to his parents. "Father, Mother, I must say the new bathhouse is excellent. It was truly a worthy investment." When Sigurd heard the word investment, he nearly had a heart attack. That bathhouse cost him a fortune. How would he ever recover from such an expensive luxury? He could not believe he allowed his son to convince him to purchase it. It would take some time for the family to recover from the amount they had spent on the commission. Or so he thought. The old baron was completely unaware how much steel had been amassed within the past 24 hours. Practically all the iron ore that had been stockpiled in the barony was converted to steel ingots overnight. Berengar only had plans to sell a few tons of it. The rest would be used as the basis for his industrial vision. When Berengar saw the painful expression his father made, he was quite concerned. "Father, you look ill. Are you all right?" After recovering, Sigurd glared at his son. He swore he would never forgive the boy for the financial loss he took commissioning that thing. "I'm fine. It's just that the bath you so thoroughly enjoyed this morning cost us a fortune to build. I don't know how we will recover." Berengar did not even take note of his father's words. At first, he merely bit into a slice of his breakfast sausage nonchalantly. It was only after he realized what his father had said that he began to laugh. Which only caused Sigurd's enraged gaze to intensify. The man's face was practically boiling in rage. "Is poverty a laughing matter to you, Berengar?" Adela had not heard the conversation, she was too busy enjoying her food. However, what Berengar said next immediately grabbed her attention. "Oh, father, if you knew how many pure steel ingots were sitting in our warehouse right now, you would never say such a thing. At this point, we are sitting on enough wealth to buy the county." Though Berengar's claims might have been a slight exaggeration, it was by no means a lie. They had significant wealth in terms of raw steel. There were currently 2 counts trying to marry into the von Kufstein family and place their potential sons-in-law on the seat of power explicitly because they were aware of how much iron ore the region had available. Hell, Adela's father was willing to sacrifice his daughter's happiness and marry her to a lazy, petty, sickly wastrel to get a claim to those resources. If the 2 counts had known that Berengar had turned the barony's current stockpile of iron ore into pure steel ingots overnight, they would be tempted to invade the barony and seize the wealth for themselves. Sigurd's jaw practically dropped to the floor as he heard this news. He had not been following his son's industrial and agricultural ventures too carefully. In his opinion, Berengar's claims were too wild to believe. However, he did have experts confirm there would be no downside in adopting the various ideas. So he decided to take a gamble and see if anything would come of it. If what Berengar had said was true, then there were dozens of tons of steel sitting in his warehouse right now waiting to be sold or processed. The old Baron could hardly believe his ears. Adela was equally shocked. She knew her father wanted the iron mines of Kufstein. She was well aware of her father's intentions to use her to get Berengar, the son and heir, to hand them over to her family when he became Baron, but now her fiancé claimed he had turned a warehouse full of iron ore into steel ingots overnight. She was equally in disbelief as Sigurd. If this were true, she would have to write to her father and convince him to change his plans for the future. Only Henriette had a calm expression as she had no idea what any of this information meant for her or her family. Instead, she was excited to hear the new bath was finally complete. The little girl had an urge to run away from the table and take a bath this instant, though she refrained herself from such unladylike behavior. Berengar could not stop chuckling. Did his father seriously think that he would coerce him into spending the family's life savings on a private bathhouse with no plan to recuperate their losses? What they would gain from selling a fraction of the steel would be enough to fill their coffers and invest in the mining industry. What steel remained would be used to start a new age of industry. After all, steel was an important component of his plans for barony-wide irrigation. Let alone the innovations to other fields of agriculture like the steel plow, combine harvester, the grain elevator, etc. These were all inventions he had planned to make in due time, but they needed a large amount of steel to implement on a realm-wide scale. The young lord estimated that the barony's fields would be filled with early forms of mechanized agriculture within a year or two, which would allow for far fewer farmers, and in turn, create more tradesmen who would be used to fuel his fledgling industry. For now, his focus was on creating steel pipes for irrigation. As long as he had the 4-field system, irrigation, and phosphate fertilizer used on every farm, this year's harvest was sure to be massive. Sigurd could hardly believe what he was hearing. He decided to excuse himself from the breakfast and immediately check with Ludwig about the details. He had to see the stockpile of steel with his own eyes to believe it. Apologies, my loving family, but it appears I have some serious business I must attend to. I will see you all at dinner. Afterward, the Baron left the dining hall and rushed to the storehouse, keeping the iron ore. Sigurd would spend the rest of the day having Ludwig walk him through the process and explain Berengar's ideas for how best to make use of such a vast quantity of steel. As Sigurd left the dining hall, Adela recovered from her shock and decided to ask Berengar a question of dire importance to her family's plans. Berengar, what exactly is it that you plan to do with so much steel? Berengar smiled at the young girl sitting next to him and patted her head affectionately. He knew why her father had proposed their marriage, and he was not about to give away the key to his family's success. First, I intend to sell a portion of the ingots, and use the profits to fill our coffers, and invest in the mining industry to increase industrial productivity. As for the steel that remains afterward, I intend to use it to implement a system of realm-wide irrigation to improve the efficiency of our agricultural production. The young lady had no idea what irrigation was or how it affected agriculture, but it appeared Berengar's ambitions were purely domestic. He had no desire to build a large army and conquer other regions. He merely wanted to increase profits and crop yields. After listening to the Count's ambitions of becoming the Duke of Austria her entire life, she felt greatly relieved that her future husband was not a power-hungry madman like her father. Instead, everything Berengar desired was to increase the quality of life and economic productivity of the people he would one day rule over. She had never before met a single nobleman who was content with his lot in life. Everyone she had ever met, including the men in her family, all desired more than what they currently had. Berengar was different. He was fine with being a lowly baron, as long as his barony was the most advanced region in the world and could defend their sovereignty. She knew now it was best to convince her father to abandon the idea of taking over the mineral rights of the region, as Berengar would put the resources to far better use than her father would. She needed to convince her father to negotiate with Berengar, and Sigurd for that matter, on a fair price for the steel they have already produced. After all, her father would not be satisfied without the iron or steel required to equip his armies. Though the matter was of great importance, she felt like spending the rest of the afternoon with Berengar, who had his schedule open due to his father taking up Ludwig's time. As such, the two took a walk across the town and conversed with the common folk. The second time around, Adela was far more social with the villagers, who began to recognize her as their future baroness. It was not until dinner when the two had returned from their second date and entered the castle's gates. Though Berengar was anxious about getting his designs to Ludwig and introduce irrigation as soon as possible, he felt as if a day or two of rest was needed every now and then. After all, he never expected his time with Adela to be so delightful. Adela also treasured the time she spent with Berengar. She felt as if she was dreaming, for the last 2 days had been so peaceful and filled with joy, something she was not accustomed to under the yoke of her father's tyranny. After dining with her soon-to-be in-laws, she retired to the new bathhouse, where she finally understood Berengar's habit of bathing twice a day. As the day's accumulation washed away from her flawless skin, she sat in the bath thinking about her recent date with Berengar. It was not until a half-hour later when she came out of the bath and saw Berengar at the doorway entrance. Though she was fully dressed in her nightgown, her hair was let down and still wet, and for some reason, this caused her great embarrassment. Thus she fled back to the room she currently occupied, avoiding Berengar's gaze the entire time. It was only after the door was safely latched behind her that she calmed down and realized she still needed to write the letter to her father. She spent the remainder of her waking hours writing the letter. What was initially planned to be a request to purchase the steel at a fair price turned into a letter from a young girl gushing about her crush. Only the very end of the letter remotely resembled her initial intentions. As if she hastily added it on after she had written everything on her mind about Berengar. Shortly after its completion, she handed it off to one of her knights and ordered him to deliver the letter to her father as soon as possible. As soon as the task was complete, she returned to her bed-chamber, where she fell asleep with a satisfied smile on her face. Berengar, on the other hand, had spent the remainder of his time bathing and drafting up blueprints for some of his agricultural designs. Though it would be a while before they could be fully implemented, it was best to have the designs drafted as soon as possible. His only regret about today was that he had failed to deliver his designs on irrigation to Ludwig. It did not matter, for he could always do so tomorrow. After all, at least Adela was happy. After finishing his work for the day, Berengar snuffed out the light of his oil lamp and crawled into bed, where he rested comfortably on his feather mattress for the rest of the night. Tomorrow was an important day in his plans for agricultural advancement.